One morning, right in broad daylight, Claudia Whitford, the HOA president, pointed her finger straight at my face in front of the pool gate and said, "You and that girl don't belong on this side of the fence." I swallowed my anger and quietly bought the entire plot of land, keeping the gate for myself. The day she stood outside the fence, screaming and crying, the whole neighborhood lit up. The last tyrant had finally slammed headfirst into the very wall she built. Sometimes, justice comes wrapped in a bold move. Which state are you in? And have you ever seen an HOA go this crazy? I remember that morning, clearly, sunlight spreading across the still surface of the lake, reflecting in sharp golden streak. Eliana, my 15-year-old daughter, and I brought along the old fishing rod her mother once loved. After months of struggling with the loss, this was the only place where we found any peace. The lake had always been an essential part of our family's emotional life, a place filled with laughter, the scent of early wind, and the final days when the three of us were still whole. I believed that at the very least, this place would never betray us, but I was wrong. As we approached the shore, Eliana and I froze. Replacing the familiar scene was a cold, barbed wire fence cutting straight across the entrance. Steel posts driven deep into the ground, tangled metal strands woven into a lifeless barrier. On the freshly welded gate, a large sign swung in the breeze, its red letters smeared and harsh. "No entry. O property." Eliana touched my shoulder, her eyes dulled as if the sky itself had collapsed. I heard her inhale, trying to suppress the crushing disappointment. The place that had once been our only refuge to remember her mother was now locked up like a prison. Before I could react, the iron gate creaked slightly. A sharp voice pierced through from behind the fence, each word drawn out deliberately, as if to dig into my ears. "Where do you think you're going?" The woman stepped out, her blonde hair neatly cropped, her face so heavily made up it looked rigid. Claudia Whitford, the name I had heard mentioned at community meeting, but never had to face until now. She was the HOA president, and it was clear she cherished the title more than anything else. Her hand swung a gleaming bunch of keys, each jingle ringing out like mockery. Her gaze was triumphant, as if she had long awaited this moment. I felt like Eliana and I were standing at the gates of a tyrant's fortress, and she was the self-appointed gatekeeper deciding who deserved to enter. Eliana stepped back, her hands clenched tightly around the fishing rod, lips together. She had just lost her mother, and now even this last emotional sanctuary was being stripped away. I didn't want her to see the fury rising in me, but I couldn't hide the hatred either. I stepped forward, looked Claudia straight in the eye. "When was this fence put up?" I kept my voice calm, though inside, a storm of curses was howling. Claudia didn't answer immediately. She tilted her head slightly, studying me, as if debating whether I was worth the breath. Then she gave a cold smile, her thin lips curling into a razor-sharp line. "Not everyone deserves to step past this fence." Each word dropped from her mouth like lead, soaked in blatant contempt. That tone wasn't meant to explain, it was meant to humiliate. I heard it like a blade slicing through my pride, a declaration that my family didn't belong here. Eliana blinked, her face drained of color, her shoulders trembling at the sound of it. I turned to look at her and saw confusion and shame in her eye, as if she had just been branded with the label, undeserving. I wanted to pull her into my arms that very moment. Claudia's presence forced me to keep my voice sharp. "What did you just say?" I asked. Each word pressed through clenched teeth, eyes locked on her expressionless face behind the gate. "I live here. This lake is a shared amenity, and no one has the right to fence off the entrance." Claudia smirked, a mocking smile etched into her artificially tight features. "That's what you think, but here in Lakeside, I am the law. People who don't fit this community should find somewhere else." She flicked keys in her hand again, and the metal flashed under the sunlight, sharp and blinding, just like the challenge in her voice. My fists clenched, blood pulsing hot at my temple. I've met all kinds of people, opportunists in business, shameless con artists, few as brazen and arrogant as Claudia. She stood there, on land I paid for with my own money, acting like a queen, and treating the rest of us like servants. What infuriated me most was the way she glanced at Eliana, cold and full of disdain. I couldn't accept that a stranger would dare make my daughter bow her head in shame. Eliana tugged lightly at my sleeve, her voice so soft it nearly dissolved in the wind. "Dad, let's go home." I looked down and saw her eyes, rimmed red. I understood then the lake wasn't just a place to fish. It was a place tied to memories of her mother, the woman who once sat patiently by the water for hours, teaching her how to bait a hook, how to wait in silence for a fish to bite. Claudia had trampled all over that memory with a single sentence. I took a deep breath, trying to swallow the rage stuck in my throat. If I lost control now, it would only hurt Eliana more. "I won't forget what you said today," I replied, my voice low but burning. Claudia let out a hollow laugh. "Remember it all you want. Won't change a thing. Keys are right here, and I decide who gets to pass through." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind the harsh stench of her perfume, and the jingle of those keys, an echo that would haunt me for many nights to come. I put my arm around Eliana's shoulder, and led her away from the fence. On the walk home, my mind was spinning, not just from the humiliation, from a rising sense of resolve. They had built that fence to push us out, but that very fence would become proof of their absurdity. I knew that one day, Claudia would pay for the contempt she had just thrown. thrown at us, and on that day, I would be the one holding the key. I stopped right at the gate of the lake, took a deep breath to steady myself. Eliana was still behind me, her eyes fixed on the warning sign, her lips trembling with fear. I knew that if I stayed silent, she would believe I had given up, that we truly had no right to enter the place once brought our family comfort. I couldn't let that happen. I stepped forward, Claudia straight in the eye, my voice calm but firm. I am a legal resident here. This lake was clearly listed as a shared amenity when I bought the house. You don't have the right to keep us out. My tone was final, each word heavy with weight. Claudia listened, then curled her lips into a cold smile. Her scrutinizing eyes moved across my body like a blade, landing squarely on Eliana's face. Then she spoke, her voice syrupy but laced with venom. People like you usually don't read the rules very carefully. The words rang in my head like a slap. I no longer had any doubt this wasn't about regulations or paperwork. This was contempt, clumsily veiled behind hollow phrasing. Claudia didn't see me as an ordinary resident. She saw me as an outsider, a stain on the community she believed she ruled. Eliana heard it, too. Her shoulders tightened, her eyes shrinking with pain. She was too young to grasp the full cruelty behind those words, but I could see that she felt the humiliation. Blood rushed to my temple, and I could feel the tension rising in my throat. I stepped closer, my voice dropping low, every syllable pressed down with fury. You can fence off the lake, but you can't fence off the truth. Do you really think a few strands of wire can hide injustice? No, Claudia. You'll see that this very fence will bury you in your own lie. Eliana looked at me, her eyes lit up, as if for the first time she saw her father standing his ground. Claudia raised an eyebrow, the challenge in her gaze shifting into irritation. Maybe she wasn't used to being confronted like, especially not by those she saw as beneath her. Her hand trembled slightly, but she quickly recovered her smug composure. She pulled a small black notebook from her coat pocket, its glossy cover stamped with the HOA logo. Taking out a pen, she opened the book, her eyes still locked on mine. Her voice rang out cold and sharp, each word deliberately loud enough for Eliana to hear. You've committed a serious violation of the lake rule. The fine is $500. I'll send a formal notice to your home, but consider this your official warning. If you attempt to approach the lake again, we'll be adding legal fees. Then, with deliberate slowness, Claudia wrote each word into the report. The pen scratched loudly across the paper, echoing in the quiet morning air. Eliana held my hand, her eyes fixed on the notebook, each word etched into the fragile landscape of her childhood. I squeezed her hand tightly, feeling the trembling in her palm. I knew that if I said nothing, Eliana would grow up with the memory that even her father bowed his head to humiliation. I looked at Claudia, my voice no longer restrained. You have the nerve to find me in front of my daughter just because we wanted to visit a place that belongs to the community? Fine, go ahead, write it down. Write it clearly, so that when the tables turn, you'll be the one forced to read every word you wrote today. Claudia looked up, her eyes flashing with a mix of fury and contempt. She tore the sheet from the pad, folded it neatly, and shoved it into my hand. You can be angry, you can complain, but rules are rules. And here, I'm the one who enforces them. I held the paper, my hand shaking not from fear, but from the weight of suppressed rage. I turned to Eliana, my voice soft, trying to soothe her. It's all right, sweetheart. It's just paper. One day, they'll have to face something 100 times more serious. Eliana nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. She didn't fully understand, but she believed me. As I walked her home, Claudia's words echoed in my mind. People like you still rang in my head, stirring parts of my past I thought I had buried. Years of discrimination, suspicious look, cutting remarks, all of it came flooding back in that single moment. I had once believed I had escaped, but Claudia reminded me that even in an upscale neighborhood, the shadow of that contempt still lingered. I tightened my grip on Eliana's hand. In my mind, firm resolve was taking shape. Claudia thought I would walk away. She was dead wrong. She had just awakened the most stubborn part of me, the part that would fight to the end to protect my family and my dignity. $500 didn't scare me, but the pain in my daughter's eyes lit a fire I could never back away from. Claudia could smirk, throw around her cheap authority to intimidate, but she had just made a critical mistake. She revealed her true self right in front of my daughter, turning a mourning meant for healing into a scar. And I swore that from that scar would grow a strength powerful enough to tear down the fence she believed was untouchable. When we got home, I opened the fine notice and read every rigid line. It was laughable. They cited Lake Access Protection Clause 4.2, stating no one could approach the lake without HOA approval. No explanation, no reference to city or state law, just a document drafted by a group of people addicted to control. I let out a dry laugh, enough to make Eliana look at me in surprise. What are you thinking, Dad? She asked, her voice timid. I patted her head and answered with quiet conviction. I'm thinking it's time this whole neighborhood finds out who really holds key. Eliana looked puzzled, but I knew I had just planted a seed of belief in her, a belief justice doesn't belong to the arrogant, but to those who dare to stand up, and I would prove it, no matter the cost. That day, I didn't return to the lake, but in my mind, plan had already begun to take shape. It wasn't just an idea anymore, it was a fire driving me forward. Claudia believed she had won with her $500 fine, but in truth, she had just signed her own indictment. I would make her understand that no fence is high enough to stop a father who's been wronged, and no wire thick enough to hide the truth. And when the day came for for me to expose her, I would do it in front of every resident, so each one could hear the echo of her arrogance from this very moment. I looked out the window, where sunlight still touched the distant lake. The image of that cold fence returned to my mind, but with it came the vision of a key gleaming in my hand. I knew the day would come when the hand holding that key would no longer be Claudia Whitford, it would be mine. And on that day, I would invite Eliana through the gate with her head held high, not to fish, but to prove that justice cannot be locked away. The next morning, as soon as I opened the door, I saw a large white sheet of paper plastered tightly onto the wooden door. Bold letters hit me straight in the face. Lake violation, $500. Below that were my name, my address, and Claudia Whitford's messy signature. The red ink was still fresh, smeared as if to emphasize the insult. I ripped the paper down hard, my hand clenched into a fist, heat rushing to my face. Eliana stood behind me, her eyes wide, her face pale. She looked at me as if asking whether this was our fault, whether wanting to fish at the lake had somehow become a crime. I saw the worry in her eyes, and told myself I would never let her live under the weight of someone else's shame. The fine notice was no different from a public accusation, displayed for the entire neighborhood to see. I stepped out onto the street and noticed a few neighbors pretending to pick up their newspaper, their eyes darting toward me. I heard whispering from an elderly couple across the road, their murmurs quickly dissolving into awkward silence when I turned around. People didn't dare confront me direct, but I knew they had read the notice, and in their minds, the seed of doubt had already been planted. Claudia had achieved her goal, to mark me as an outsider, someone the neighborhood should keep at a distance. That evening, the community meeting was held in the small hall at the center of the neighborhood. I knew Claudia wouldn't stop at the fine, and sure enough, she had prepared an entire performance. When Eliana and I entered, the room was tense like a drawn wire. Residents sat in rows, their faces a mix of curiosity and caution. Claudia stood tall at the podium, one hand resting on a folder of documents. Her gaze swept over the crowd, pausing on me longer than necessary. Then she spoke in a shrill voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If we let just anyone into the lake," she emphasized every word, "then this place is no better than some cheap public pond." Her voice echoed through the room, carrying undisguised contempt. A few residents lowered their heads and nodded slightly, while others avoided eye contact. I felt Eliana tremble beside me, her hands gripping the edge of her shirt. I knew I couldn't let her take another blow. I stood up abruptly, the chair slamming against the wooden floor with a loud thud that brought the entire room to a halt. "I need to make this clear," I said, loud enough to cut through the murmurs without a microphone. "That so-called public pond she just insulted is the last memory my daughter has of her mother, and right here, in front of everyone, she trampled on that memory." The room fell into heavy silence. I saw a few stunned faces, some flushed with embarrassment. No one had ever dared confront Claudia so direct. I kept my eyes locked on her without blinking. Claudia hesitated for a brief second, but then the mocking smile returned. She raised the thick folder, her voice sharp. "Personal feelings don't override rules. If you want to swim in a filthy pond, feel free to move out. We protect the lake to preserve the value of this entire community." Eliana stood up, her hand gripping mine. I felt her body tremble, but she lifted her head and stared straight at Claudia. I had never seen that kind of resolve in my daughter's eyes. I knew this moment would stay with her, and she needed to see me stand firm. I turned to the surrounding residents. "How many of you were asked before the fence went up? How many of you truly believe this lake belongs to Claudia Whitford? Or are we all just letting one person use the name of the community to satisfy her thirst for power?" No one answered. Some stared at the floor, others looked at me, and then turned away. They stayed silent out of fear, afraid of becoming Claudia's next target. But that silence was its own kind of admission. I could hear my heart pounding, full of rage and sorrow. Claudia slammed the folder down on the table, the sound cracking like a gavel. "This is your final warning. If you continue disrupting this meeting, I'll take this matter to court. I have enough evidence to prove your family has seriously violated our regulation." Her voice was as sharp as a blade, but I saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to fight back in front of everyone. I didn't respond. I just held Eliana's hand tighter. I knew the battle wasn't over, but the spark had been lit. From that day on, I understood Claudia didn't just want to control the lake. She wanted to control the spirit of every resident in the neighborhood. And the way she humiliated me in public was her message. Anyone who dared resist would be shamed. Back at home, I hung the fine notice in the living room, where Eliana could see it every day. I told her, "Remember this day. They want us to feel ashamed, but one day, they'll be the ones ashamed for believing a lie." Eliana nodded, her eyes bright, filled with both fear and hope. I knew she believed in me, and I swore I wouldn't let her down. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat alone at the table, staring at the notice. Every line felt like a chisel carving my resolve deeper. I understood then taking down Claudia would take more than anger. I needed proof, I needed the truth, and I needed to pull this community out of the shadow of fear. I muttered to myself, the day she tried to shame me was the day she started digging her own grave. Have you ever known someone so unreasonable that they built a fence to shut out their own neighbors? Share your thoughts below. The following afternoon, as I got home from work, I stepped out of the car and immediately saw a sheet of paper stuck tightly to the windshield. It was a glaring yellow slip, bold letters. Parking violation, $200. I frowned because the car was parked squarely in the garage of my own house, not blocking anyone, not intruding on the street. They were looking for an excuse. I tore the paper off with force, my hand gripping so hard the sheet crumpled instantly. Eliana was watching from the upstairs window, face clearly anxious. She had seen enough to understand this was no longer about the lake, they were coming directly for us now. I brought the notice inside and tossed it onto the table. The ink still smelled fresh, as if they had laughed while posting it just moments ago. Before I could even process what was happening, Eliana rushed downstairs, face pale. She was breathing hard, her voice shaking. Dad, on the way home today, some HOA people stopped. I froze, pulled her close, and told her to explain everything. Eliana trembled, her eyes brimming with tears. They were standing right in the walkway, arms crossed, and one of them leaned down, looked me straight in the face, laughed, and said, "This isn't a place for people like you." Hearing that, I felt my entire body tremble. That wasn't just an insult, it was a cruel, discriminatory remark, shaming her in a way no 15-year-old should ever have to endure. I held Eliana by the shoulder, trying to keep my voice calm, while a fire raged inside me. I asked for names, descriptions, and every detail, and Eliana gave them without hesitation. I knew I couldn't let this pass in silence. That very evening, I brought both the parking citation and Eliana's account to the HOA office. The room was bright under harsh light, the air filled with the sharp scent of fume. Claudia sat behind a polished wooden desk, her hands clasped, eyes sharp as blades. Threw the notice onto the table, my voice low and hard. My car was parked inside my garage. My daughter was stopped and humiliated. I want an explanation. Claudia leaned back in her chair, smiling faintly as if hearing an amusing story. She flipped over the fine notice, tapped her finger lightly on it, then looked up and said, with deliberate emphasis, "This falls under security regulation. We have the authority to oversee all safety-related matters in the neighborhood." I slammed my hand on the desk, making Eliana flinch behind me. "Security?" I nearly shouted. "What kind of security finds a car parked in its own garage? What kind of security allows its members to corner a child and shame her? Is that what you call security, Claudia?" She shrugged, her lips curling in deliberate provocation. "If you feel it's unfair, you can file a written complaint. But I doubt the outcome will change. Everything has been recorded according to proper procedure." Her voice dragged out, each word carefully measured to assert dominance. I looked her straight in the eye, realizing this was no longer about the lake or the fine. Claudia had launched a calculated campaign aimed directly at my family. Each move was an attack on our dignity, meant to make me and my daughter feel unwelcome. I swallowed the rage, lodged in my throat, folded the paper, and turned to leave. Eliana held my hand tightly, her breathing unsteady. I knew that in her eyes, what she had just witnessed confirmed a painful truth. That woman could do anything and face no consequence. On the way home, my mind spun. In just a few days, things had escalated into a full-blown confrontation. Claudia wanted to turn our lives into hell, to drive us out of this neighborhood without a shred of legal justification. I recalled Henderson's warning, how for years Claudia had done this to others, piling up violations, stacking fines, until people were worn down and forced to sell at a loss. Suddenly, I understood. Now it was our turn. Back home, I shut the door and collapsed onto the couch, my eyes locked on the fine notice. Eliana sat beside me in silence, still holding my hand as if letting go would make everything fall apart. I looked at her, saw fear and expectation in her eyes. She needed to know if her father could protect. I placed my hand over hers and said quietly but firmly, "Don't be afraid. I promise you, they won't drive us out. They'll be the ones who pay for every single thing they've done." That promise wasn't just for Eliana, it was to remind myself. Claudia might believe she held all the power, but I knew I couldn't back down. Not for me, for my daughter. I refused to let her become the 7th or 8th victim in a long line of families pushed out by a stack of fake fines. That night, I opened my laptop and began researching everything I could about the HOA and the legal boundaries of its authority. I needed to know exactly where Claudia's power ended, and I needed proof that she had already crossed that line. Outside, the wind howled, the steel fence clanging like mocking laughter. I closed my eyes and pictured Claudia's smug face, that arrogant smile as she spoke about security regulation. What she didn't know was that her arrogance would be her greatest weakness. I turned to see Eliana fast asleep on the chair, tear stains still marking her cheek. I pulled a blanket over her and told myself that from this moment forward, we were no longer on the defensive. Claudia had crossed the line, and I would strike back. The blows she thought would break us were forging me into someone ready to fight with everything I had. I folded the fine notice, placed it in the drawer. It would no longer serve as a symbol of shame, but as the first brick in the wall I would build against Claudia. And I knew that wall would be strong enough, not just to protect Eliana, but to bring Claudia down inside the hollow castle of power she had built for herself. I stepped onto the sidewalk in front of my house on a heavy afternoon, still seething from the chain of events over the past few days. A ticket on my car, Eliana insulted. Claudia was still parading around, bragging about so-called security regulation. I walked around the neighborhood, hoping to find some quiet, but my mind kept looping through every humiliating image the HOA had inflicted on us. As I turned back toward home, I ran into the elderly black man who often walked his dog past our house, thin but sharp-eyed, his voice steady and calm. He was Henderson, a longtime resident I had only exchanged polite greetings with until now. Today, he stopped at the gate, glanced around, then walked closer and lowered his voice. "You know," he whispered, "the lake was never owned by the HOA. They just lease it." I froze, stunned. All the anger inside me suddenly had a new direction. His words echoed through my mind, pushing aside the helplessness that had weighed me down for days. Never owned by the HOA. That phrase was like a sliver of light breaking through the locked, dark Claudia had tried to trap us in. For the first time since this fight began, I felt a flicker of hope. I looked at Mr. Henderson, my eyes silently pleading for more truth. He took a deep breath, glanced around the neighborhood again, as if still wary of HOA eyes and ears. "I've lived here for over 20 years, he continued, his tone steady but heavy. "When this place was first developed, the lake was kept private property by the company. The HOA was granted a lease to manage it as an amenity, but the title was never transferred. They've relied on the silence of the residents to act like it's theirs. If you dig, you'll find the gap." His words cut clean through the haze in my head. Everything we'd been subjected to, the fence, the fines, the public shaming, could unravel if I could prove Claudia never actually held the authority. I nodded firmly, gratitude swelling in my chest. "Thank you, Henderson. You just gave me the most important thing I've had so far, a direction." Mr. Henderson gave a faint smile, but his eyes still held caution. "Be careful. Claudia's got plenty of people behind her, and they won't hesitate to play dirty. But the truth is still the truth, and it might be what saves your family. Don't ignore it." I nodded and watched as he and his small dog disappeared down the street. The wind shifted, bringing a strange lightness with it. For the first time in weeks, I no longer felt cornered. The idea that the HOA was just pretending to own something it merely leased made me realize this wasn't over, not even close. I headed home, my steps faster, firmer than when I'd left. Back in the living room, I opened my laptop and pulled out the full file from when I bought the house, flipping through every page. I scanned the purchase agreement, the amenity clause, and the attached HOA document. I reread the section about the lake and spotted the vague language. The lake is under HOA management for the duration of the agreement with the property holder. There was no line anywhere stating that the HOA owned the lake. I had ignored it before, thinking it was just administrative phrasing, but now, every word stood out like proof of deception. I opened the city's public access portal and searched the property database. The page loaded slowly at first, but eventually, the list appeared clearly. The registered owner was still the original development, a name long forgotten by most of the neighborhood. The HOA was listed only as the managing leaseholder, nothing more. My heart pounded, each beat urging me to dig deeper. I knew I had just struck the biggest crack in the wall of power Claudia had built. I sat for hours, taking notes on every detail, capturing screenshots, and saving everything into a dedicated folder. My hands trembled, not from fear, from exhilaration. This was the beginning of the investigation. I couldn't reveal anything to anyone, not even other neighbors, until I had solid proof. Claudia was clever, and if she sensed danger, she wouldn't hesitate to strike back with everything she had. I had to stay quiet, let her think I had given up, while in truth I was flipping the board. Eliana came down the stairs, her hair tousled from a nap. She saw me in front of the screen, the blue light casting shadows on my tense face. She approached and asked softly, "What are you looking for, Dad?" I closed the laptop, smiled, and brushed her hair back. "I'm looking for a way to take back what belongs to us. Don't worry, it won't be long." Eliana nodded, maybe not fully understanding, but in her eyes, I saw the flicker of belief. I knew that from that moment, I had crossed the boundary of fear. I was no longer the one taking every hit from Claudia. I had a direction, a secret, and a path to reverse the game, and the journey had just begun. As night fell, I sat by the window, watching the moonlight flecked off the lake in the distance. In the darkness, the barbed wire fence still stood tall, but to me, it no longer felt untouchable. I whispered to myself, "Claudia, you can build fences, you can shout about rules, but you can't change the truth, and the truth will destroy you." I opened the drawer, pulled out the fine notice that was still there, and laid it flat on the table. On the back of the paper, I wrote 4 words: "Investigation begins now." I smiled, for the first time in days, not out of anger, but with the confidence of someone ready to fight back. From the moment Mr. Henderson gave me his quiet warning, I knew I had an invisible ally, and I also knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But if I stayed patient, if I held tight to the truth, the day would come when Claudia would stand before the entire neighborhood and face everything she had tried to keep hidden. Closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair, my mind painting the picture of the day the lake gate would swing open. Eliana would walk through, no longer with her head down in shame, and I would stand beside her, not as someone paying fine, but as the one holding the key. After Mr. Henderson's warning, I began digging deeper. But the more I read through documents, the more I realized I couldn't do this alone. Every page, every contract, no matter how valuable, still lay flat on the table. While out there, Claudia continued surrounding my family with threats and humiliation. I understood that unless I found others who had gone through what I was facing, I would never be able to create real change. The opportunity came one afternoon when I stopped by the small shop near the neighborhood. I ran into Mrs. Gonzalez, the Latina woman who always greeted me with a tired smile. That day, she stood at the checkout counter, holding a few small flower pots, her eyes avoiding mine. I said, "Hello," and by chance, I learned her story. She had been fined $300 just for planting flowers in her front yard without notifying the HOA. The flowers were a species she had brought from her homeland, carrying deep personal meaning. Claudia claimed they disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic and issued a violation note. I saw injustice etched clearly in Mrs. Gonzalez's eyes, the same quiet endurance I had seen in Eliana. We stood there, talking for a while, and for the first time, she opened up. "It's not just me," she said, her voice choked. "Others have been fined for ridiculous things too. But who dares to speak up? Claudia's got the entire board behind her, and residents are afraid of losing their home, afraid of retaliation." That conversation pushed me to reach out to more people. I met Mr. Malik, an African-American man who once hung an American flag on his porch for Independence Day, a symbol respected almost everywhere else. But to Claudia, it earned him a $150 fine for displaying an item that altered the visual uniformity of the neighborhood. Mr. Malik recounted it bitterly, his eyes hard but pained. "I served in the military. Flying that flag is pride for me." Claudia looked at me like I didn't deserve it. She didn't need a reason. She just wanted me to feel like I didn't belong. I also heard the story of the Rivera couple who owned a gentle dog. One early morning, while walking the dog, a group from the HOA blocked their path and claimed their pet did not meet security standards. The dog didn't bark, didn't bite, yet they were fined, along with a snide remark, "This neighborhood isn't for messy people like you." As they told the story, their voices wavered, eyes turning red. I could feel the shame they carried from that sentence, a deep wound to the dignity of people who had only ever tried to live respectfully. The more I listened, the more I saw a clear pattern. Every target was black, Latin, immigrant, or simply someone whose way of life was slightly different. Not a single long-time, white, wealthy resident had ever been fined for planting flowers, flying a flag, or walking a dog. Every so-called regulation had been weaponized Claudia to aim straight at the people she wanted gone. One evening, I invited all of them to Mr. Henderson's house. He agreed to let us use his living room, where the warm yellow light softened the tension. We sat in a circle, each person telling their story, voices hesitant at first, then gradually breaking into anger. I saw clenched, tearful eyes, but also a kind of relief. Finally, someone was listening, someone understood. When Mrs. Gonzalez recounted how Claudia stopped her at the gate and mockingly asked, "Why don't you go back to where you belong?" the entire room went silent. I looked around and saw everyone lower their head, swallowing their rage. Then Mr. Malik spoke, his voice low, bouncing off the wall. "Claudia wants to scrub the lake clean of faces she doesn't like. She wants to turn this place into a neighborhood only for people who look and think like her." That statement silenced the room, but within that silence, I felt something shift. People began looking at one another, and in those looks was agreement. They were no longer alone. I spoke slowly, making sure everyone could hear. "She targets each of us to make us feel small, but if we stand together, she can't defeat us all." We talked for hours. I proposed forming a secret group, a place where everyone could share evidence, fines, photos, recording, anything that revealed the truth. Henderson agreed to keep the records since he had legal knowledge and the means to store them. Mrs. Gonzalez offered to handle communication, slipping messages into everyday conversations with care. Mr. Malik promised to defend the group if anyone faced threat. The Rivera couple volunteered to take photos and record HOA members' actions. I saw determination etched into every face. These were people once silent, now finding their voice. That night, before anyone left, each of us placed a hand on the wooden table in the center of the room, a silent vow that none of us would back down again. As everyone left, Henderson put his hand on my shoulder, his voice steady. "You've started something Claudia never saw coming. Careful, but don't stop. Planted a seed, and sooner or later, it'll turn into a storm." I stepped out into the night, the cold wind stinging my face, but my chest burned with heat. I knew the road ahead was dangerous, but I also knew I was no longer alone. I had allies now, a group of residents ready to stand up to injustice, and from that moment on, I believed that barbed wire fence was nothing more than a thin disguise. Because behind it, we were piecing together the truth piece by piece until the day we could bring it fully into the light. That community meeting was held in the neighborhood's largest hall, a square building in the center of the development, bright glass windows. When Eliana and I walked in, the atmosphere was unlike any previous gathering. Instead of murmurs of discontent or heavy silence, the room buzzed with lively chatter, as if people were expecting something significant. On stage, Claudia Whitford stood tall, microphone in hand, her confident smile gleaming. Behind her, A large screen displayed shimmering images of the lake, digitally enhanced, accompanied by renderings of sleek, modern structures. As the noise gradually subsided, Claudia lifted her chin and spoke loudly. "Fellow Lakeside resident," she began, "as your HOA president, I am pleased to announce the most ambitious redevelopment plan we've ever undertaken. I will transform our lake into a private, world-class retreat premium amenity. From this point forward, the HOA will have full control over the area." Scattered applause broke out, and a few wealthy residents nodded approvingly, clearly pleased by the prospect of increased property value. But many others, especially Black, Latin, and immigrant families, remained silent, their expressions uneasy. I watched them all, and saw what Claudia was doing, playing to the protect our home value mentality of some, while trampling the rights of others. Claudia went on, her tone like a business. She flashed up glossy projection, promising skyrocketing home value, luxury features like a lakeside restaurant, a private lounge, even a boat dock. Then she paused and swept the room with her cold gaze. "To make this vision a reality," she announced, "we need to contribute together. Starting next month, each household will pay an additional $50 per month toward the lake maintenance fund. This is a necessary step to turn our dream into reality." The room immediately filled with murmur. $50 wasn't a huge sum for some, but for families with moderate income, it was a heavy burden. More than that, everyone knew the so-called maintenance fee was a front, and we all knew whose pocket it would end up in. I looked at Claudia and saw the gleam in her eye, not just from belief in her plan, but from an ambition she couldn't hide. She didn't say it outright, but I knew exactly what she was after. Claudia wanted to claim the lake for herself. She was collecting money from residents to build up enough capital to buy it from the development company. I gripped Eliana's hand, fury rising in my chest, but I stayed silent, because I knew I held a piece of information Claudia didn't. While she boasted about her grand plan, I thought of what I'd uncovered through the city's property database and my quiet conversations with Mr. Henderson. The truth was, the lake had never belonged to the HOA, and the original development company was in financial trouble. They were preparing to sell the lake to raise cash, and I had seen the insider notice. That was the twist Claudia hadn't counted on. She was gathering funds, believing she would become the lake's owner, when in reality, the opportunity was already in my hand. In the hall, a Latino resident stood up, his voice trembling. "We were never asked about the fence, and now we're being forced to pay extra fees. Is this really about the community?" Claudia immediately shot him a cold glare, her voice sharp. "Everyone has to sacrifice for the greater good. If you can't accept that, maybe you don't belong in Lakeside." The loaded statement silenced the entire room. The man sat back down, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. I felt Eliana squeeze my hand tighter. She whispered, "Dad, she wants to get rid of everyone who isn't like." I nodded, looking around the hall. Many others were thinking the same thing, but no one spoke up. They were afraid of fine, of being blocked at their doors, of becoming the next target. Claudia knew it, and she used that fear to cement her power. When the meeting ended, Claudia stepped down from the stage, surrounded by people shaking her hand and offering congratulations. I stepped back and led Eliana outside, but inside me burned a different kind of resolve. Claudia thought she was nearing victory, but she didn't realize the game had changed. I was no longer the passive man taking her fine. Now, I was the one who knew the lake was about to be listed for sale, and I held the chance to turn it into Claudia's downfall. That evening, our secret group gathered at Henderson's house. The conversation was charged, and everyone was fired up after the meeting. Mrs. Gonzalez slammed her hand on the table. "She's not even pretending anymore. $50 a month is just bleeding us to feed her ambition." Mr. Malik nodded, his eyes sharp. "Claudia thinks the lake will end up in her hand, but we know the truth. The question is, are we ready to put this on her?" Everyone looked at me. I took a deep breath, then spoke slowly. "I've reviewed the doc. The development company is preparing to sell the lake. If we can find a way to buy it before Claudia does, the game is over. She'll fall right at the place she's most proud of." The room fell silent, then burst into urgent chatter. Henderson smiled slightly, his eyes seeming to brighten. "This is our chance, but we have to keep this absolutely secret. Claudia finds out, she'll do everything in her power to stop us." I nodded, looking at each person in the group. I knew this was no longer just about my family and Claudia. This was a fight for the entire community, those who had been smeared, fined, and pressured to leave. Now they could strike back, not with shouting, but with truth and with rightful authority. That night, when I returned home, I sat by the window and looked down at the lake. In the darkness, the barbed wire fence still stood clearly, reflecting the streetlight. Claudia believed that the fence was a symbol of power, that she could control everything behind it. But I knew that before long, that same fence would become a symbol of defeat. Because once the lake was in my hand, Claudia would be the one standing outside, powerless, with no keys left to jingle in front of the resident. I closed the window, a strange calm rising in my chest. The path to retaliation had opened, and I could already see the destination. The days Claudia spent bragging confidently were the same days she was edging closer to the cliff, and I would be the one to push her over. I had grown used to Claudia's petty fine, her ridiculous violation notice, and her contemptuous glances, but I never imagined she would go this far. One morning, I heard unusual murmurs as I stepped out the door. Two neighbors stood nearby, talking while glancing in my direction, then quickly fell silent when they caught my eye. As I walked toward the street, I saw Henderson approaching slowly, a troubled look on his face. He glanced around and then whispered, "Claudia's spreading rumors that your family is drowning in debt and about to dump the house cheap." I froze. That wasn't just gossip, it was a direct blow to my dignity. I could handle judgment aimed at me, but I knew a rumor like that would destroy Eliana's. I nodded my thanks to Henderson, then turned back toward the house, every step feeling heavier than stone. That afternoon, Eliana came home, face pale, eyes red. She had barely walked through the door when she broke down, choking on her words. "Dad, my friends said we're ruining the neighborhood, that we're too poor and have to sell the house. They laughed and said I'd have to leave school." It hit me like thunder inside my skull. I pulled her into my arms as she sobbed into my shoulder, her small hands clutching my shirt. Every tear felt like a blade driven into my chest. I couldn't hold back anymore. I knew Claudia had always tried to push me to the edge, but now she had crossed the line. She had touched the one sacred thing in my life, my daughter. I stood up, my heart pounding like war drum, my whole body trembling not from fear, from fury. I didn't wait, didn't calculate. I went straight to the HOA office, where Claudia sat like a queen among her fake paperwork. She was there, calmly reviewing her latest batch of citations, her face as unaffected as ever. I opened the door and walked in without knocking or greeting. Claudia looked up, slightly surprised to see me, then immediately gave me that familiar mocking smile. "Here to pay another fine? Or maybe negotiate your home's sale before the rumors become real?" I stared straight into her eyes, my voice low, each word sharp as a blade. "You can aim your weapons at me, but the moment you went after my daughter, you signed your own sentence." The smile on Claudia's face faltered, her eyes flickering with a flash of unease before she masked it behind her usual smugness. "You should be careful with your word. This is a community, we uphold order here, and those who can't handle it, well, they tend to remove themselves." I took another step forward, slamming my hand down on the wooden desk, the sound echoing across the room. "Stop lying to yourself, Claudia. I know the lake doesn't belong to you. I know you're bleeding the residents dry to scrape together enough money to buy it. You think you can hide the truth, but you can't hide your cowardice when you go after a child." Claudia's brow furrowed, her lips tightened, trying to maintain her composure, but the pen in her hand trembled slightly. I realized the blow had landed exactly where she hadn't expected. I didn't wait for her reply, just held her gaze and spoke as if carving a vow into the air. "I won't forgive you. I will make you pay for every tear my daughter has shed." Then I turned and walked away, leaving Claudia frozen in place. Her fake smile vanished. On the way back, I could still feel the rage burning inside me. I thought of Eliana, of the look in her eyes when she recounted the humiliation her classmates had thrown at her. I knew I couldn't erase that pain, but I could turn it into purpose. Every emotion I had buried in the past days, from the moment the fence was built, from the absurd fine, from the sharp-edged bigotry now hardened into a cold determination. That night, I sat alone in the study, warm light spilling over the documents and photos I had collected. I began organizing my notes, compiling every piece of evidence, the lake's paperwork, stories from other residents, every senseless citation Eliana and I had endured. I wrote without skipping a detail, each line like a nail driven deeper into the coffin of Claudia's authority. I knew the day of reckoning was drawing close. Eliana came in, her eyes still red, calmer now. I pulled her close, placed my hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Promise I won't let them keep doing this. One day, you'll see Claudia bow her head, not you." Eliana looked up at me and nodded soft. In her eyes, I saw a flicker of belief. I knew I had to keep my promise, not just for pride, but for that fragile faith. After she went to bed, I stayed seated. My words from the HOA office echoed in my mind. They weren't a threat anymore, they were a vow. And I would keep that vow with everything I had. The next day, I saw the rumors spreading faster. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, others looked at me with thinly veiled pity. But I didn't see shame in their stare. I saw fire, because they were watching someone who hadn't gone down, someone preparing to strike back. I walked past the steel fence, stopped, and stared at it for a long time. It still stood tall, with the sign, "No Entry, HOA Property," hanging boldly across. But now, it was no longer a symbol of Claudia's power. To me, it was a symbol of the vow, of the fury that had been refined into strength. I whispered to myself, "One day, you'll be the one locked out, Claudia." As I turned away, I knew I was ready. This was no longer just about accessing a lake. This was a battle for honor, fight to protect my daughter, to wash away the shame cast by one woman's tyranny. And I would not stop until Claudia bowed her head. What would you do if someone smeared your child's name to force you out? Let me know in the comment. I knew threats wouldn't bring Claudia down, but the truth could. The truth, when laid out in the right order and held up to the light, could cut deeper than any blade. I spent days organizing every document, working nearly non-stop in the small room, dimmed with sunlight, where my desk was cluttered with old files, cold coffee, and screenshots from the city's property database. Night after night, I hunched over the dim glow of my computer screen, eyes aching but mind racing. I backed up old contracts, cross-checked with zoning maps from when the neighborhood was first established. I didn't skip a single line, digging through meeting minutes from when the original residents were still around. Every document pointed to a painfully clear truth. The lake had never been HOA property, not one. It was only temporarily leased from the original development company, a conditional amenity, with no formal paperwork ever transferring ownership. Every move Claudia made, from fencing the lake to collecting maintenance, was nothing more than a performance of power. Play she had cast herself in, as director and self-proclaimed owner, forcing residents into supporting role. I wrote a long post, careful with every word, no embellishment, no sensationalism, no emotional manipulation, just the truth, stark and irrefutable. I published it on a major community forum, where residents from all over the state shared stories about their HOA. At the top of the post, I uploaded a photo of the towering steel fence, the no entry HOA property sign swinging in the wind, overshadowing the peaceful lake behind it. Just below, placed a copy of the property deed, still in the name of the development company, never updated to the HOA. The next image showed the lake maintenance notice Claudia had imposed on residents each quarter. I ended with a question that needed no answer. So what gives them the right to claim the lake as their own, fence off the community, and demand extra payment for maintenance? Within hours, my phone started buzzing nonstop. Notifications poured in, and comments multiplied exponentially. Residents everywhere were outraged. Some called Claudia a public land. Others wrote, "Does she think she's some kind of queen?" The backlash quickly spilled beyond our little neighborhood. People began sharing their own stories of HOA elsewhere, creating kingdoms of arbitrary rule, enforcing absurd fines through silence and fear. But this time, someone had stepped forward with document proof, with a flame that was spreading. Eliana sat beside me, eyes wide, mouth open as the flood of comments scrolled up the screen like a waterfall. For the first time in her life, she saw that truth could bring down a force that once seemed untouchable. She laughed through her tears at a comment that read, "If the lake belongs to the HOA, then the moon must belong to her too." I pulled Eliana into a tight hug, and in that moment, I could feel her faith beginning to return. She didn't say anything, but the light in her eyes said everything. Dad did the right thing. The next morning, the news spread farther than I had expected. A major local newspaper ran a front-page headline, "Residents blocked from lake by HOA fence." The photos I had provided were printed in sharp detail, the steel fence glaring under the sunlight, with the no entry sign pointing directly at the reader like a public insult. The article also quoted several other residents, speaking of unjust fine, and how the board consistently refused financial transparency. That very afternoon, the local television station aired a clip showing residents gathered in front of the fence, talking, pointing, seething. The shimmering lake was no longer a place of relaxation, but had become a symbol of conflict between ordinary people and manufactured authority. The entire neighborhood was stirred. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began murmuring. Many came to my door, bringing pastry, tea, but more importantly, quiet kind of support. Henderson, the oldest man in the neighborhood, smiled gently as he handed me a bundle of yellowing paper. Violation notices he had received Claudia, saying they might help strengthen our case. Mrs. Gonzalez brought a recording, Claudia's shrill voice clearly heard, mocking her during a community meeting. These pieces of evidence, small fragments on their own, began to form a clearer picture. This was no longer a personal conflict, but a system of abuse upheld by fear and silence for years. The HOA began to stagger. They called for an emergency meeting, posting notices everywhere, bold letters. "We will clarify the misunderstanding." People were no longer naive. The meeting was packed. Claudia still stepped up to the podium as usual, wearing a gray blazer, hair neatly pinned, but this time her gaze was not steady. She claimed everything was baseless rumor, that someone is trying to sabotage the community with misinformation. She tried to project confident, but her hand gripped the papers tightly, eyes darting between stares. I didn't speak, it wasn't necessary. I sat in the middle row, silent, letting the residents' eyes speak for me. And their eyes had changed, from fear to doubt, then to open disdain. A man stood up, his voice calm but commanding. "If the lake truly belongs to the HOA, why do the documents still list the development company as the owner?" Claudia Dodd gave a vague answer about legal processes underway, presented no proof. The silence after that was heavy as stone. I knew the first strike had landed. The truth had crossed the fence, past the warning signs, and pierced through the lies. It was spreading now, unstoppable. Back home, Eliana was stretched out on the sofa, hugging a pillow, eyes bright. "Dad, people are starting to believe. They're not afraid of her anymore." I sat beside her, ran my fingers through her hair, and smiled. "This is just the beginning, sweetheart. Once the truth has been spoken, nothing can stop it." That night, I sat again with my secret group in the small kitchen, the light from the laptop casting a glow over tired faces full of determination. We read every comment, every post, every anonymous message sent in. There was laughter mixed with tears. Everyone in the group understood that, for the first time in years, this fight had a real chance of being won. Henderson spoke, his voice hoarse but firm. Claudia might still be here, but she's lost her strongest weapon, the fear we used to have of her. I looked out the window, where darkness settled over the steel fence still looming by the lake. But this time, it was no longer a symbol of power. It was proof of shamelessness, now fully exposed. I knew this battle wasn't over. Claudia wouldn't go down quietly, but from now on, she could no longer hide behind her mask. The mask had fallen, and the true face of abuse of power now stood in the light, unmistakable, twisted, and with nothing left to conceal. After the truth about the lake broke out online and quickly spread to the press, Claudia still clung to her arrogance as if untouched, but I could see it a crack behind her eyes. She had been shaken. Her attempts at damage control, calling everything baseless rumors and misleading information, only deepened the residents' suspicion. Disapproving glances began to surface during meeting, whispers traveling faster than any HOA bullet. Claudia, once the master manipulator, now wavered on the very throne she'd built for herself. But just as I thought public opinion might drown her, I realized I couldn't rely on that alone. I needed something concrete, an irreversible move to end her fabricated authority once and for all. Henderson once told me not to strike the surface, go for the root. The root, in this case, was legal ownership. And I began to dig. It wasn't easy to trace ownership through a maze of documents, but I was patient, spending hours in digital archive, cross-referencing old data with municipal maps and transaction records from decades ago. Every night, after Eliana went to sleep, I sat before my computer, sipping cold coffee, turning over every clue, until finally, I found a name, the original development company, still listed as the legal owner of the lake. Their name was faded in HOA paperwork, crystal clear in land registry files, a bitter irony. I contacted an old acquaintance in real estate. He owed me a favor, and when I asked him to arrange a meeting, he didn't ask questions. The day I stepped into the development company's office, the atmosphere was nothing like the HOA meetings drenched in politics and manipulation. This place didn't pretend. It smelled of money, calculation present in every detail, from the clear glass conference walls to the expensive espresso machine tucked by the corner. But here, at least, things were transparent. They didn't hide their intent. They wanted money. The man who received me was middle-aged, white shirt, a gray tie, and eyes sunken like someone long used to pressure. He didn't waste time. After a few pleasantries and a cup of coffee, he opened a folder, sighed, and spoke plainly. We're under financial strain. Our next development phase needs immediate capital, and the lake no longer brings value. We've decided to sell. Honestly, the quicker the deal, the better. My heart pounded as I listened. Felt like I was standing before a massive door, my hand already on the knob, just waiting to push it open. When he named the price, I almost held my breath. $280,000. Less than what the HOA is trying to collect from residents for lake maintenance. I sat motionless for a few seconds. The numbers swirled in my head, but above them all rose the images I couldn't erase. Claudia standing defiantly at the meeting podium. Residents sitting with bowed heads like criminals awaiting punishment. Eliana sobbing because her classmates mocked her for not complying with the HOA. All of it came together, pushing me toward one undeniable decision. I had to buy that lake. It was the only path to reclaim our dignity, not just for me, but for Eliana. I left the development company's office with a thin folder that carried the weight of a war. $280,000 wasn't a small sum, but I had prepared for something far greater in my life. I had lived frugally for years, combined with the inheritance left by my parent, and I knew I could pull it together. On the way home, I opened my phone and started calculating every detail. I made notes, reviewed each account, not overlooking a single cent. This wasn't just a real estate transaction. This was the counterstrike, the defining move on the board. That evening, I sat with our trusted resident group in Henderson's living room. The scent of pine, the soft yellow light from the low-hanging ceiling lamp, and a heavy silence filled the space as I recounted the meeting in detail. No one spoke until I ended with the number $280,000, and the room erupted in sharp breath. Gonzalez clutched her chest, eyes glistening. If you buy the lake, Claudia will lose everything. She can't put up fences if she doesn't own the land. Malik narrowed his eyes, voice hard as steel. This is the cleanest strike. She's collecting fees to chase a dream, and you're about to beat her to it. I nodded, but warned immediately. We must keep this quiet. If Claudia finds out, she'll campaign, she'll threaten, she'll sabotage any way she can. Everything must be completed before she has a chance to react. Everyone agreed. I could see the resolve in each face. This was no longer personal. It was a community war. When I got home, Eliana was sitting downstairs, hugging her schoolwork but not reading a word. When she saw me, she looked up, her innocent eyes laced with worry. Did you find a way, Dad? I sat down, brushed her hair gently, and whispered, I'm one step ahead of her. Eliana didn't ask anything more, just gave me a faint smile. But even that small flicker of light told me she was beginning to believe in me fully. In the days that followed, I entered the final stage of preparation. I contacted the bank and began withdrawing from my saving, piece by piece. I sold off several small investments, streamlining my financial portfolio. With every signature, I remembered Claudia's sneering remarks and reminded myself I was flipping the board. I missed nothing. This transaction could not fail. While I prepared in silence, Claudia continued to play the role of the HOA queen. She organized more meetings, bragging about her plan to turn the lake into a luxury retreat, unveiling dazzling rendering, and urging residents to contribute funds. While many were still hesitant and afraid, I could sense the tide shift. What they didn't know was that the lake they were being lured into funding was, in truth, about to become mine. Time was not on my side. The development company needed capital fast. Claudia could catch wind of something at any moment. I set the date for signing, gathered all necessary documents, and hired a lawyer to double-check every clause. Each night, I sat alone in the quiet kitchen, white light casting over the purchase file, and I felt I was brushing up against real power, the power to restore justice. Inside me, fire of retaliation burned hot. Claudia believed she was drawing closer to her dream of lake ownership, but in reality, she was walking on a thin, cold layer of ice. I was the one who had already sawed through its foundation. One more step, and she would fall through. When Eliana slept, I would often stand by her door, quietly watching her rest. I wasn't fighting just for myself. I was fighting so Eliana could grow up without bowing her head to a power built on falsehood. I wanted to teach her that justice doesn't come from the system. It comes from the resolve of someone who refuses to let go. And that is exactly what I was doing. I finalized everything with one thought in mind. Claudia would never suspect that while she was still collecting every last dollar, still dreaming up glossy designs to lure trust from residents, I had already signed the deed of ownership. She didn't know I was one step ahead, and that step would be the final one to end her reign. I was nearly done preparing for the lake purchase legal document, the rollout plan, even the communication strategy to reassure residents were all falling into place. But deep down, I knew ownership papers alone wouldn't be enough. Claudia was the kind of person who, when losing one form of control, would immediately build another fence to compensate and regain her grip. To her, defeat was never the end, only a temporary retreat while she calculated her next strike. I needed something that left her no room to maneuver, no justification, no way to twist things in her usual fashion. A deep cut to her credibility, which was already beginning to crack. I knew I had to be patient, to wait for the missing pieces to appear before delivering the final blow. One evening, as I sat among a chaotic pile of documents, my mind spinning with numbers and clauses, the phone rang. It was Henderson. His voice was low but carried an unmistakable urgency. "There's someone who wants to meet you. He used to work in banking, reviewed the HOA's financials. This might be what you need." I didn't hesitate. Henderson wasn't someone who trusted easily, so if he said, "might," that meant it was more than likely. I arranged a meeting immediately, unwilling to lose even a single day. We met at a rundown coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a place no lakeside resident would ever think to visit. The atmosphere was hushed, filled only with the soft hum of the espresso machine and the muted glow of yellow light cast over worn wooden table. The man's name was Raymond, in his early 50s, wearing a heavy coat, looking tired, but his eyes told a different story. They were steady, focused, and clearly carrying something weighty. He got straight to the point. After a brief introduction, he opened a weathered leather brief and placed a folder on the table, its pages yellowed with age. I audited the HOA accounts when Claudia applied for a loan on a small project. During the review, I found something off transfers from the maintenance fund to a personal account, followed by doctored reports to cover it up. I made copies of the original. At the time, it was just to protect myself, but now, this might help you. Through the pages, scanning columns of numbers. My heart pounded. It was clear, painfully clear. Tens of thousands of dollars were siphoned off without justification, and later sanitized through altered report. I looked up at Raymond, a storm of gratitude and anger rising in me. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Raymond held my gaze, then sighed, his voice dropping. "The bank didn't want to get tangled up with an HOA, especially after approving the loan. And I had a daughter about to start college. I couldn't afford to lose my job, but when I saw her put up that fence around the lake, publicly slandering resident, I knew it was time to speak. I can't stay silent anymore." I shook his hand, the words of thanks catching in my throat. In my hands now was a sharpened blade, something that could pierce straight through the armor Claudia always wrapped herself in. But I stayed calm. This file wasn't meant to be unleashed right away. It was meant to be used at the right moment, when there would be no escape left for her. Less than a week later, as if fortune or justice was slowly tilting in my favor, another surprise arrived. During a closed-door meeting at Henderson's house, a dimly lit room with dark wooden walls and warm yellow light, a Latino resident named Alvarez quietly pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. His face was pale, his eyes unsteady, clearly still afraid, but his voice firm. "I have a recording from a private board meeting. I was going to keep it for myself, just in case, but after seeing what you're doing, I think it's time to share it." We plugged the USB into the laptop. In near total silence, the audio began to play. Claudia's voice clear, unfiltered. I don't want the lake full of loud black people. They ruin the image of this place, bring down property value. We have to stop it at all costs. The sentence struck the room like a slap across the face. Henderson gripped the arm of his chair, eyes burning. Gonzalez covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Malik slammed his hand on the table, voice catching. This isn't about rules anymore. This is blatant discrimination. I sat motionless, felt like the air had been sucked from my lungs. Claudia wasn't just a scheming woman. She was someone who held contempt for human beings. All the polished language about preserving community value now lies exposed, nothing more than a hollow disguise for prejudice and personal ambition. I looked around. The eyes of everyone in the room, people who had once been belittled, cornered, were now lit with clarity. No more fear, no more hesitation. They now held in their hands the proof that could shatter the throne Claudia had sat on for far too long. I spoke, my voice steady. We have to guard this carefully. When the time comes, it'll be the final blow. She won't have a way out. Henderson nodded, carefully placing the USB into a small wooden box, locking it, and handing it to me. You keep it. This is undeniable evidence of discrimination. One day, it will end her reign. I brought the USB home and placed it in the safe alongside Raymond's file. Looking at the two of them, I felt as if I were holding two matches capable of burning down the entire false castle Claudia had built on fear and manipulation. But I wasn't rushing. I knew if I moved too early, she'd twist the truth, spin the narrative, maybe even countersue. But if I waited for the right moment when no one believed her anymore, these pieces of evidence would be the end. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, looking out at the lake. The barbed wire fence still stood, the streetlights casting long shadows, like metal fingers trying to strangle the last flickers of light. But inside me, fence had already begun to tremble. I whispered, Claudia, you think you're in control, but every document, every word you've ever said, now rests in my hand. And when I release them, you'll have nothing left to cling to. Eliana came down the stairs, her eyes still heavy with sleep, her hair a tangled mess. She looked at me, then quietly sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. Dad, is everything going to be okay? I wrapped my arm around her, whispering, it will be, sweetheart. I have new allies now, and thanks to them, we won't have to endure this much longer. Eliana closed her eye, completely trusting. I knew I wasn't allowed to fail. Not when so many had placed their faith in me, had handed me their final hope. I closed my eyes too, and inside me, resolve flared. The moment to strike hadn't come yet, but I was ready. And when that day arrived, Claudia wouldn't be facing just me. She'd be facing the truth itself, undeniable and absolute. In the days following the evidence I received from Raymond and the recording Alvarez handed over, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift in a way that's hard to describe. It wasn't a sudden explosion, not a revolution that tore through overnight, but a slow, simmering tremor, spreading like cracks across glass small, almost invisible at first, but widening with each passing day. Claudia kept up her usual demeanor, the authoritative stride, the expressionless face always tinged with disdain as if nothing had changed. She still projected strength, even increased her visibility, strolling around the neighborhood with a ceremonial air, as if to reassert dominance. But it no longer worked the way it used to. Her power was no longer absolute. News that the lake, the symbol of control Claudia had long used to emphasize HOA authority, had never truly belonged to the association, spread faster than I expected. Each person passed on a sliver of information, added a detail, let go of a little fear. The unreasonable fees Claudia began imposing in a desperate attempt to tighten her grip only added fuel to the fire. She demanded extra payments for security maintenance, added more fencing around the lake, and started fining people for parking a few centimeters outside the line. What was once silently endured now sparked fury. I felt the fracture in every sidewalk conversation, in the glances exchanged among neighbors, uncertain, skeptical, but also beginning to carry the flicker of awakening. People were starting to ask questions, starting to whisper, and most importantly, starting to push back. The next community meeting unfolded under an entirely different atmosphere. The hall, which had always been quiet, filled with sidelong glances and reluctant nods, was now buzzing with murmurs before the doors even opened. The mood was tense but electric. Seats filled quickly, no one smiled, but their eyes gleamed the gleam of those holding a secret, waiting for the moment to strike. Claudia entered as always, clad in a dark suit, her cold stare sweeping the room. But this time, she paused longer, as if trying to read the crowd, and maybe, somewhere deep down, she sensed what was coming. She slammed her hand on the table, her familiar shrill voice slicing through the air, now sharper than ever. I've heard all the ridiculous rumor, but let me make something clear. You lose me, and this place turns into a slum. I'm the reason your property values haven't hit rock bottom. Is that what you want? Her words struck like a spark into a barrel of fuel that had been smoldering for weeks. A middle-aged woman stood up. I couldn't recall her name, only that she often walked her dog every morning. Her voice trembled, but it was firm. And how exactly have you kept our property values up? With arbitrary fines and fencing off the lake? A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Some people nodded. Others leaned toward their neighbors to whisper. Claudia flushed red, glaring at the woman as she snapped. Shut up. If you don't understand, don't stir up trouble. I'll say it again. Without me, this place would be nothing but a filthy slum. Her voice cracked, no longer carrying the calm control she had spent years perfecting. I sat there, fists clenched, each word of hers pounding in my chest like a drum. Claudia's words weren't just insult, they were contempt, dripping with arrogant disdain for every single person living here. I stood up, my heart thudding, but my voice held steady, a steadiness fueled by fury. The only slum here is your leadership. You're the one dragging human dignity to the ground, not these residents. The room fell completely silent. A few heavy seconds passed. Then, those murmurs began to shift into approving nods, into subtle pats on the back. And then, scattered applause broke out. Tentative at first, hesitant, but growing like water, finally bursting through a dam that had held too long. People started looking around at one another, as if realizing for the first time, we're not alone. Claudia turned to me, eyes sharp like blades, but this time she found no word. Her lips trembled, then tightened. She slammed her hand on the table and shouted louder than ever. You're all being manipulated. This is a smear campaign orchestrated by a few bitter people. Without me, this HOA will collapse into chaos. But no one flinched. Her threat now sounded like the fading echo of a dictator losing her grip. An African-American man, I remembered he once got fined for parking overnight in front of his house, spoke up. If the HOA collapses, good, at least we'd have peace. An elderly Latina woman rose too, leaning on her cane, but her voice was resolute. A slum is where one person crowns themselves ruler and everyone else stays silent. We don't need that kind of slum anymore. Zero. Claudia stood frozen, as if she'd just been slapped in front of the entire room. Her face went pale, then gray. She tried to keep her tone firm, but her voice wavered, thinner now. You people don't know what you're doing. You'll regret. But this time, no one shrank back. People stood taller, their gazes stronger. I saw the man in front of me no longer slouch. I saw the old woman smile soft but with deep, quiet satisfaction. The meeting ended in chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that healed. The old order was cracking, and that was necessary. For the first time, Claudia was facing a community that no longer submitted in silence. For the first time, she was no longer the only voice, echoing through a room that had once been her fortress power. The scattered applause today, I knew, would soon become a rising tide. And when that happened, Claudia would have nowhere left to stand. I left the hall with Eliana. She held my hand tightly, small fingers warm and firm. Her eyes were bright, full of trust, the kind of light I hadn't seen in her for a long time. She whispered, her voice soft, clear, "Dad, people are starting to see it. They don't believe her anymore." I gave her hand a gentle squeeze, nodding, a surge of resolve rising in me stronger than ever before. We walked slowly under the streetlight, which somehow seemed to shine brighter than usual. I knew the moment to strike was drawing near. And this time, I was not alone. I had waited for this moment for so long every day, every hour since Claudia erected that barbed wire fence across the lake, trampling Eliana's memory and turning my family into the target of every dirty game. The evidence in my hand, the moments when the community first dared to clap back at her, those were only stepping stones toward the final move. I knew that if Claudia were allowed to continue, she would twist the situation by any means necessary, tighten her grip on the resident, and smear even more innocent people. I couldn't rely on public opinion alone. I needed legal power, something undeniable, and finally, I had it. One early morning, I walked into the developer's office with a carefully prepared file in hand. The representative across from me had the same stoic face as before, but this time, he offered a faint smile. "You've got everything ready?" I nodded, placing the briefcase on the table. Inside was the full cash amount I had scraped together, along with every legal document I'd meticulously vetted. Flipped through each page, checked every figure, and after a while, handed me the final contract. I picked pen, my hand tight around it, and took a deep breath. When the last stroke of ink met the paper, I knew everything had changed. The lake was officially mine, no longer owned by the developer, and never again claimed by the HOA. As I stepped outside the office, I paused at the door, looking up at the sky. A strange sense of lightness settled into my body. I thought of Eliana, of the spark in her eyes, when she first heard the community was starting to push back. I knew that someday she would understand that this very morning was the moment all our past suffering was finally answered. While I quietly signed the contract, Claudia was still basking in her delusion. I heard from several residents that she was holding small meetings, painting visions of the lake becoming a luxury retreat, promising property values would double. Colorful renderings were plastered everywhere on bulletin boards, on the HOA website. She beamed as she accepted applause from a few gullible residents who still believed her rule would bring them gain. I stayed on the sideline, said nothing, and never rushed. The more she bragged, the deeper she sank into her illusion, and the heavier my final blow would land. Henderson called me one evening, his voice brimming with excitement. "You did it, didn't you?" I smiled, neither confirming nor denying, and simply replied, "Wait until the entire neighborhood hears the truth. That's when everything really begins." He laughed, a sound full of relief. "I've been waiting for this day a long time." My plan was clear. Claudia unveil her new project to the entire neighborhood. Let her climb to the highest pedestal by herself, and then, right after, I would pull the curtain down. I wanted the residents to witness the moment she turned into a joke on the very stage she had built. I wanted Eliana to see the person who had made her cry, tremble, falter, and collapse under the weight of the truth. The days of waiting grew tense. I went to work, acted normal, but inside I was burning. Every time I passed the lake, I looked at the fence and thought, soon, it won't be a symbol of oppression anymore, it will be evidence of a collapse. The more confident Claudia became, the more certain I was that I had chosen the right moment. On the day of the big meeting, the hall was packed. Residents crowded in, whispering, buzzing with speculation. On stage, Claudia appeared like a queen, microphone in hand, her smile smug and glowing. She began with her usual speech, praising efforts to protect the community's value, then pulled down a large screen and projected a shimmering resort concept for the lakeside. Under dim lights, luxurious buildings and elegant docks appeared, drawing murmurs of awe from some in the crowd. Claudia raised her hand, voice rising, "This is the future of Lakeside, and I will be the one to lead us there. With just $50 a month, we'll turn this lake into a landmark, a place no one can rival." I stood at the back of the room, silent, observing. Claudia was soaking in what she thought was her moment of triumph, the eyes locked on her stage, the sweet promises filling the air. But I knew, in just a few minutes, all of it would vanish like smoke. I let her finish her presentation, let the polite applause echo, let her bow, and sweep her gaze across the room in victory. Then I stepped forward slowly, deliberately. Murmurs rose as people noticed me walking toward the stage. Claudia froze for a beat, then quickly put on her usual sneer. "Here to stir things up again? Let me finish speaking to the residents before you play your little game." I looked her straight in the eye, my voice steady, echoing across the hall. "You've said enough, now it's my turn, and I promise, after this, everyone will understand who this project really belongs to." I pulled a folder from my briefcase and raised it under the spotlight. "This is the official purchase agreement. The lake has been transferred from the development company to me. Not the HOA, not Claudia Whitford, me, a lawful resident who paid in full. From this moment forward, the lake has nothing to do with the HOA." The room erupted in whispers, then quickly swelled into a wave of uproar. Claudia stood frozen, her face stiff, the microphone visibly trembling in her hand. Some residents laughed aloud, others clapped thunderously. I spotted Eliana at the end of a row, her eyes wide, then lit up, tears streaming, but this time, they were tears of joy. I took another step forward and continued, my voice unwavering. "You built fences, issued fines, smeared my family's name, and collected extra fees from residents just to feed your dream of possession. But that dream is over. You just unveiled your project to the entire neighborhood, and now everyone knows it was never yours. It's mine, and I will return the lake to its original purpose, a place for the community, not a tool for power grab." The applause grew louder, cheers erupting across the hall. Claudia opened her mouth to speak, but the noise drowned her out. No one wanted to hear her anymore. She stumbled, her face flushed, and took a few steps back. I stood tall, feeling all the past humiliations begin to dissolve. I knew this wasn't the end. Claudia would thrash, would try to strike back, but I also knew I had just delivered the hardest blow. The entire community had witnessed it. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows. Claudia had lost what she needed most, blind trust and unquestioned obedience. I turned to the residents, my voice calm but firm. "We've been silent for too long, but now there's nothing left to fear. Remember today, remember that the truth can change everything." The applause returned this time louder, fuller, more united, a clear sign that the community had awakened. I looked at Claudia one last time and saw a panic in her eyes I had never seen before. Then I turned and stepped off the stage, silently reminding myself, the decisive move had been made, and the board now belonged to me. How many HOAs do you think are hiding private interests behind the name of community protection? Share your thoughts in the comments. The day of the decisive meeting arrived, and the community hall was packed. More people showed up than usual, partly out of curiosity, partly because of the relentless announcements Claudia had issued over the past few weeks. She had even set up a massive backdrop behind the stage, displaying a luxurious rendering of a lakeside resort, low-rise buildings, manicured lawn, golden lights stretching along the water's edge. In the front row, a handful of residents known for their flattery were already seated, their faces eager as if awaiting the launch of a grand new development. Claudia stepped onto the stage, binder in hand, her smile brimming with confidence. She tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the hall and silencing the crowd. Her voice was shrill but forceful. "Dear resident, today I bring you a new vision. Our lake will no longer be an abandoned space or a source of conflict. It will be transformed into a boutique resort, a distinguished landmark for Lakeside. With this project, the value of every property will double." A few scattered claps broke the silence, mostly from her loyal circle. Claudia raised her hand, signaling for more applause, then continued. "To realize this project, we need investment. Each household will contribute a small monthly fee. This isn't a useless expense, it's an investment in our future. Once the resort is complete, the lake will generate lasting value, turning this neighborhood into a citywide icon." I sat in the back, observing every detail. She was savoring her peak moment, convinced she had everything under control. Many residents exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of doubt and frustration. They were exhausted from the constant stream of arbitrary fees. Claudia's commanding tone kept them from speaking up, at least for now. I felt Eliana beside me, her small hand resting on mine, eyes full of anticipation. She knew what was about to unfold. Claudia turned to the final page in her binder, her voice rising, triumphant. "I've outlined the roadmap. With unanimous support, we'll begin next quarter. And remember, None of this would be possible without my leadership. The room fell silent for a few seconds. That was the moment I had waited for. I stood, the chair behind me toppling loudly, drawing every eye in the room. I walked slowly up the aisle, holding a folder I had prepared. Claudia's brow furrowed, her lips curling in disdain. You again, here to ruin another meeting? I didn't respond immediately. I stepped into the center of the hall, lifted the folder high, and spoke my voice loud and clear, every word deliberate. I'm sorry, but this lake does not belong to the HOA, and it certainly doesn't belong to Claudia Whitford. As of today, it is under my legal ownership. The entire hall erupted. The murmurs turned into shouts, then quickly into thunderous applause. Some people burst out laughing, others cheered like they'd just been set free. Eliana shot to her feet, clapping until her palms turned red, her face beaming with joy. Henderson sat nearby, his eyes glistening, a gentle smile on his lip. Gonzalez dabbed at her tears with a handkerchief, while Malik stood up and let out a victorious yell. Claudia was frozen. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide, her mouth agape, but unable to form a single word. The hand holding the microphone trembled, and when her voice finally came out, it was broken and weak. No, this can't be. This is my project. I took another step forward, raising the ownership certificate high for all to see. This is the signed contract with the development company. Black ink on white paper. Undeniable. I purchased the lake legally and transparently. Every project she just presented is a fantasy. She has no authority here anymore. The applause grew louder, rolling across the room like a wave. Dozens of residents stood up, whistling, shouting their support. Those who had once feared Claudia now held their heads high, no longer hiding their outrage. An elderly woman shouted from the back of the hall, "That's enough, Claudia. We don't believe you anymore." Claudia wavered, her face flushing red before turning ashen. She stepped back, eyes darting around the room, searching for support from her loyal followers, but even they lowered their heads, unwilling to stand by her now. A fake smile vanished, leaving only panic and disgrace. I lowered my voice and addressed the crowd. We've been deceived for too long. They built fences, collected fees, humiliated us all to serve their own interests. But today, the truth is out. The lake is no longer a tool for power. It's returning to its original purpose. It belongs to the community, not to someone's greed. Eliana gripped my hand and whispered, "You did it, Dad." I looked at her and nodded, feeling a relief I had never known. Claudia tried to recover, but her trembling legs betrayed her. The applause drowned out any attempt she made to defend herself. I knew this was the moment she would never forget, the moment the entire community turned its back on her. In that instant, I felt every humiliation, every fine, every slur, every one of Eliana's tears come full circle, paid back in one complete, resounding victory. Claudia Whitford, once screaming from her lofty pedestal, now stood pale, shaking, and defeated before us all. I closed the file and stepped off the stage amid cheers. The battle wasn't over, but now, the scales had clearly tipped, and I knew, from this day forward, Claudia was no longer the one who decided our fate. The hall was filled with applause, cheers, and a long-suppressed sense of vindication pulsing through the crowd. The clapping wasn't mere celebration, it was a declaration, an unofficial statement, yet far more powerful than any document Claudia had ever brandished to intimidate. It was the sound of a community standing up the first time, of people finally reclaiming their voice after years of veiled control and quiet oppression. I saw Claudia frozen in place, as if the ground beneath her had opened. Her pale face no longer held its usual composure. Her eyes were vacant, her lips clenched, her hand trembling like someone dangling off a cliff, grasping at life. She clutched the microphone small, fragile, as if it were the last thread of power slipping through her fingers. But instead of retreating with dignity, instead of stepping down quietly, Claudia suddenly let out a guttural scream, hoarse and desperate. "We'll sue. Do you hear me? The HOA will sue you. No one gets to steal this lake from this community." The scream echoed off all four walls, a relic of an era quickly fading. In the past, a threat like that would have been enough to silence the room, to bow head, to trigger fear. But now, it was met only with scoff. No one believed in her threats anymore. No one wanted to be ruled by someone who wielded bylaws like shackles. A few residents exchanged glances and shook their head, as though witnessing the final act of a long, tired play. Henderson, once fined for painting his front door the wrong shade, simply let out a dry chuckle, as if all those years of restraint had finally paid off. I took one step forward, standing tall in the middle of the hall, holding the file high. My voice, calm and steady, stood in stark contrast to Claudia's unraveling. Each word landed with sharp precision, no shouting necessary, the silence growing heavier with every sentence. "You can sue if you want. First, take a look at the lease agreement the HOA signed with the developer. It expires this month. From now on, the HOA holds no legal authority over the lake. So what exactly do you plan to sue me for?" The words hit like a bomb, extinguishing the last ember of hope Claudia clung to. She froze, her face flushed, then turned ghostly pale. Her lips moved, but nothing came out. No one in the room needed further clarification. The truth was undeniable. The lie, the self-made rules, All had been built atop a foundation long since rotted. Murmurs began to spread, then turned into open laughter. A man in the third row let out a loud laugh. He could no longer hold back. A group of Latin women giggled openly, unable to conceal their scorn. The applause returned not for Claudia, but for the truth exposed, for the collapse that could no longer be reversed. I looked straight at Claudia. In her eyes now was panic, a raw fear she had always hidden behind the mask of authority. The woman who once stood so defiantly, who once dared to point at Eliana and say she didn't deserve to live here, was now just a shadow, stripped bare under the light of truth. I continued not with the tone of accusation, but with the cold delivery of a sentence. You talk about lawsuits, but deep down, you know better than anyone that it was the HOA that illegally seized the lake. You built fences, collected money, and fined residents, all based on a lease agreement that expired. You weren't just wrong morally, you were wrong legally, and that's what will crush you. Claudia flailed, almost unconsciously, muttering broken fragments. You're just a troublemaker. I've protected this place for years, but no one wanted to listen anymore. Every word she uttered only deepened the disgust. Her voice faded beneath the murmur, beneath the eyes that no longer avoided her gaze but stared back in open contempt. Those who had once bowed their heads now held them high. An elderly Asian woman, who usually walked quietly every morning, stood up and struck her cane hard against the floor, like a drumbeat marking the end of an era. You took our money. You made us feel ashamed. That's enough, Claudia. I glanced around the room and saw how every face had changed. Malik clenched his fist and nodded at me. Gonzalez exhaled deeply, as if shedding a weight he'd carried for years. Eliana stood in the crowd, eyes blazing, shimmering with emotion but still lit with youth pride. She had just witnessed, with her own eyes, the downfall of the very person who once made her cry, who made her feel like an outsider now being judged by the same community that once stood silent. Claudia stumbled backward, still clinging to the microphone like it was her last lifeline in a sea of fury. She shouted a few more meaningless phrases, but her voice echoed like a misplaced whisper in a hall that no longer welcomed her. A man in the back row stood and called out, firm and unshaken, "If you still think you represent this community, take a look at what this community now thinks of you." His words rang like a curtain call. Another round of applause erupted loud, steady, relentless, like hammer blows, sealing the coffin of Claudia's authority. I turned to her one last time, slow and composed, like someone delivering the final verdict in a public trial. "Claudia, you've lost. There's no fence left to save you, no fine left to conceal the truth. You can keep shouting, but the residents are awake now. They're not afraid of you anymore." Claudia stood frozen, her eyes wide, her face contorted in a storm of rage, fear, and despair. She scanned the room for a supportive glance, a hand to reach for, but found only cold faces, averted eyes even from those who once followed her blindly. No one wanted to stand with her now, not a single one. Everything she had built, every flowery promise, every grand eco-lake project, every rigid rule in the guise of maintaining living standards, was now nothing more than rubble. The resort renderings, the so-called special maintenance fee, all of it had turned to scrap paper. I returned to my seat beside Eliana. She squeezed my hand, eyes locked on Claudia. She whispered, unable to hide her satisfaction, "Dad, she doesn't have any power left." I nodded, still watching the woman who had once made so many people bow their head. Now, she was shriveled, small, lost, standing alone in a room flooded with light. The room didn't need a closing statement. No one had to stand up and declare anything. Everything was already clear. The verdict had been delivered. And Claudia Whitford, the woman who once manipulated an entire community, had officially lost the one thing she had always relied on, the people's fear. In its place, the only thing that remained was contempt. The storm might not be over, but in that very moment, I knew the battle had turned. Claudia could scream until her voice gave out, but now she was fighting the air. As for me, I was no longer alone. I had an entire community behind me. After the final blow I delivered at the meeting, when all the evidence and truth were laid bare, before an outraged crowd, Claudia could no longer hold onto the seat she had clung to for so many years. The power she once wielded so used to control, to punish, to intimidate anyone who dared defy her, now scattered like a thin layer of dust, swept away by the wind. And that wind was no longer just one person like me, it was an awakened community. In the days that followed, the HOA fell into chaos. Not the kind of chaos driven by unruly mob, but the slow unraveling of a system that had operated on fear and blind obedience. Some members of the board, once Claudia's closest allies, fell suspiciously silent. They stopped speaking up during meetings, avoided responsibility, as if afraid their voices would mark them by association. Some resigned quietly, with no farewell, no official letter. Others claimed family matters and disappeared altogether. I heard that the few remaining members had begun arguing openly in the HOA office, trading blame, and accusing Claudia of dragging them all into disgrace and disaster. In less than a week, the once mighty machine that had issued penalty letters, commandments, now looked like a sinking ship, water pouring in from every direction, and everyone scrambling to jump before it went under. Meanwhile, the world outside was anything but quiet. News of the HOA's collapse and my confrontation with Claudia spread like wildfire. On social media, people shared the image of me holding up the lake ownership documents in front of Claudia, her face pale as if splashed with cold water in front of a crowd. Residents from other communities flooded the comment, calling it the hardest slap in the face to HOA arrogance all year. Local papers ran continuous coverage, describing the atmosphere in Lakeside as undergoing an internal earthquake. One outlet even dubbed Claudia a queen crumbling at the gates of her self-made castle. I walked down the street, and for the first time in months, I was no longer met with sidelong glances or wary avoidance. Instead, there was respect recognition. A few neighbors came up to shake my hand, gripping it firmly. Others laid a hand on my shoulder, offering a silent but resolute thank you. Because of you, I can finally hold my head high, living here, a middle-aged man said, voice thick with emotion. I didn't need to ask his name because now, we stood on the same side. And that was enough. I knew the moment had come. Fence, the clearest symbol of oppression and seizure, could no longer remain as a bitter reminder of the helplessness residents once felt. On a crisp morning under light cloud, Eliana and I walked to the iron gate where the sign, No Entry, HOA property, had long hung like a declaration of war. In the pale early sunlight, that old metal plaque looked more offensive than ever. A crowd of residents had already gathered, their faces a mixture of anticipation, indignation, but above all, a silent yet fierce expectancy. I stopped in front of the fence, laid my hand on its cold surface, then turned to face them. They were looking at, waiting for what everyone knew, deep down, was about to happen. My voice rang out, each word slow and deliberate. This fence no longer belongs to the HOA. From now on, only those I invite may pass through. The words cracked through the air like thunder in a clear sky. A near-sacred silence fell, then shattered into an uproar. Applause erupting like crashing wave. People cheered, clapped each other on the back, shouted as if shedding a weight carried for years. Many pushed forward, staring at the fence with blazing eyes, as though the one who had locked them out had finally been cast aside. Eliana stood beside me, her face glowing, her small hand gripping mine as if to lend me strength. Her eyes shimmered with pride, the kind I had long hoped she'd never have to lose. From the crowd came voices. Claudia, look at this. This is the truth. Another shouted, we've had enough, now it's your turn. The shouts poured in like hail, like arrows loosed at the figure who had once stood at the height of power. I turned and saw Claudia retreating to the back, face pale, body trembling. She stared at me, eyes wild, burning, lips moving without sound. And then, finally, she forced out one hoarse, barely audible sentence, heard only by me. You'll regret. But her words were swallowed in the roar of a crowd demanding justice. No one flinched or feared her old threats anymore. Instead, every eye on her held only contempt, as if looking at a ghost from the past screaming to prove it still mattered. Someone spat on the ground as she passed. Someone else shook their head with a dry laugh, watching a long, tired act reach its end. I stepped closer to the fence, gripped the no entry sign with both hands, and tore it down, flinging it to the ground. The metallic clang rang out like a bell of liberation. The crowd erupted again in thunderous applause. I turned, held up key, the only one that unlocked the gate, once known as the restricted zone, and declared, from now on, this lake will be open to those who deserve it. No one will ever use it again to humiliate others. Eliana looked up at me, her lips curling into a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't just a smile of joy, it was pride. To her, this moment erased every tear-soaked night, every insult, every time she was treated as lesser. I knew this wasn't just my but a victory for an entire community that had been trampled by unchecked authority. From that point on, the HOA all but collapsed. The board no longer dared to hold public meetings. The penalty notices, once plastered on residents' doors, vanished. Threatening letters, the watchful glares, were now just memory. People began to look at each other with relief in their eyes. Children laughed along the sidewalk. Dogs barked. Music drifted from backyards. Everything felt alive again after years of being strangled by rule. I walked the neighborhood like any ordinary person, but this time, my heart felt as light as air. As for Claudia, she was now only a shadow. From holding power, she had become a punchline. But I knew she hadn't disappeared entirely. Her final threat, you'll regret, still echoed in my mind, not out of fear, but as a reminder. Blind arrogance always demands a price, and those who build fences to trap others will, in the end, be buried by those very fences. I knew that to end this for good, legal action and purchasing the lake wouldn't be enough. Claudia had thrived on the fear she sowed, and now that fear was gone, I needed something else to ensure she never had the chance to rebuild her power. That something was the light of media exposure, something no petty tyrant can withstand. I spent countless nights in my study, organizing every piece of documentation. The paperwork Raymond provided, the bank statements showing Claudia siphoning HOA funds into her personal account, the audio recording Alvarez gave me with Claudia's chilling voice. I don't want the lake full of screaming black people, the photos of barbed wire fences erected at the lake's entrance, and the video of her pointing and shouting no entry at resident. I cataloged it all, numbered each item, and wrote brief caption. When I was done, I knew I was holding an indictment no one could deny. One morning, I sent the entire file to the local newspaper, along with a short message. This isn't just the story of one neighborhood. This is the story of power abused under the guise of community protection. Just hours later, a reporter called back, his voice elect. We've seen it. You have no idea this is explosive. We're airing it immediately. That evening, I turned on the television. Eliana sat beside me, with Henderson and a few close neighbors gathered to watch. On screen, the news logo appeared, followed by the anchor's solemn face. A neighborhood in the city has been rocked by a major scandal involving its HOA. HOA president Claudia Whitford is accused of erecting fences, collecting unauthorized fees, and making racist remarks. Then the footage played, Claudia pointing at the fence, screaming, "No entry," beneath a glaring red sign that read, HOA, property. The room fell completely silent, and only the television could be heard. The anchor continued. An audio recording captures her saying, "I don't want the lake full of screaming black people," sparking outrage among residents. Financial records also reveal tens of thousands of HOA dollars funneled into her personal account. The broadcast cut to video interviews with residents, voices shaking. "We were blocked at the gate, told we didn't belong here." Eliana looked up at me, her eyes wide, then squeezed my hand. "Dad, the whole country sees the truth now." I nodded, feeling like a massive weight had finally lifted from my chest. The next day, Claudia's face was everywhere on television, news sites, even national outlets. Footage of her fencing off the lake and shouting, "No entry," played on a loop. Her contorted face burned into public memory. Memes spread like wildfire. Someone photoshopped her in front of the White House, yelling, "No entry." Another crowned her HOA queen, with a tiara made of barbed wire. Claudia, once self-proclaimed queen of Lakeside, had become the nation's punchline. On social media, the comments poured in. One person wrote, "She deserved every bit of it. Who builds a fence around a public lake?" Another replied, "This is a living example of HOA corruption." Even veterans weighed in, blocking residents from the lake, banning flags, fining people for planting flowers. This isn't community protection, it's oppression. Thousands of shares turned the Lakeside story into a national headline. As I walked down the street, strangers nodded in greeting. Some even stopped to shake my hand and say, "You did what most people only dream of doing." Henderson grinned, his eyes gleaming. Claudia used to think her voice was law. Now the whole country is laughing at it. Claudia issued a weak response, press release claiming all information was twisted to defame her. But no one believed it. The evidence was too clear, the words in the recording undeniable. The footage of her yelling, "No entry," too vivid to forget. Legal analysts on television weighed in. Claudia's actions show signs of civil rights violations and financial misconduct grounds criminal investigation. The residents of Lakeside were furious, but this time they weren't afraid. They gathered outside the HOA office, holding signs that read, "Give us back our lake," and "No room for bigot." When I stepped out with Eliana, the crowd erupted in applause. Many shouted, "You gave us a voice." I looked around and saw faces that once bowed in silence now lifted high, filled with pride and confidence. Eliana smiled, and for the first time after so many tear-filled days, she said, "Dad, she doesn't scare me anymore. Now she just looks like a..." I pulled her into a hug, my own eyes stinging. Every emotional wound Claudia inflicted on my daughter had now been healed by exposure, by truth, and by a light that the entire country had witnessed. I know this storm isn't over. Claudia may try to claw back, hire lawyers, scream one more time, but the truth has been documented, broadcast, and seen by millions. She holds no power to intimidate anyone anymore. When the night falls quiet, I sit back and replay the broadcast. I see myself stepping up, holding that ownership certificate, seeing Claudia's pale face, and the crowd erupting like thunder. I know, this is the justice she earned for everything she did. Do you think this is the fairest ending for those who abuse power? Share your thoughts. After the national media simultaneously exposed Claudia, I knew the moment for direct retaliation had arrived. The local newspapers that once avoided the topic now ran bold headlines, and social media was in an uproar. The image of her distorted face, standing in the middle of the assembly hall surrounded by defiant applause, spread like wildfire. Every post, every video clip was another deadly blow to the reputation Claudia had spent years carefully building. But to me, that still wasn't enough. I didn't want her to merely suffer a temporary disgrace. I wasn't looking for a fleeting humiliation that would allow her to resurface in a few months with a new title. I wanted a true ending, final, irreversible blow that would ensure Claudia could never return to who she once was. I went to the lake one early morning. The air was slightly cold and damp, the grass still heavy with dew, and the lake's surface was so calm it was nearly still. The morning light wasn't yet bright, but it shimmered gently across the water in soft gold. Everything felt peaceful, almost unusually so, and that very peace made me feel the contrast more sharply with the past. The times Eliana and I had been stopped right here, confronted by a soulless sign and Claudia's cold, judgmental stare. The times I had walked away, holding my daughter's hand in silence, knowing that words would change nothing if power didn't belong to us. Now, all those memories came rushing back, not to enrage me, but to confirm I was about to do the right thing. I brought with me a new set of locks, the sturdiest I could find, heavy, polished, and clicking shut with a crisp, unmistakable snap. Under the curious eyes of a few early morning walkers, I removed the old lock that Claudia once held up like a symbol of absolute authority and replaced it with the new one, carefully installed like a seal on a declaration. I kept a single key tucked deep in my coat pocket. From now on, the right to open the lake gate rested solely with me, no sharing, no negotiation. Immediately after, I installed a large wooden sign, hand-cut in Malik's workshop, nailed firmly in front of the gate. I wrote the message myself, private lake, entry by my invitation only. Each stroke of the pen was a hammer blow to the title, community property, Claudia had long exploited. I stepped back a few feet, watching the sign stand tall in the morning light, as curious eyes paused to read it. Some smiled, some nodded, others walked up and gave me a light pat on the shoulder, no word, just a look that told me they had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Not long after, word got out. And then Claudia appeared, just as I had predicted. She didn't come alone. One of the last remaining members of the old board accompanied her. Her blonde hair was neatly styled, cream-colored dress flawlessly pressed without a wrinkle. But nothing in that polished exterior could hide the panic in her eyes when she saw the new lock and the large sign. She strode briskly toward the gate, back rigid, as if trying to preserve some remnant of her former authority. But the moment her hand touched the metal bar, and she realized the lock wouldn't turn, her face twisted as if someone had thrown a bucket of cold water on her. A crowd of residents had already gathered, quietly watching, as if waiting for the final act of a play that had gone on too long. Claudia rattled the bar, then screamed, her voice shrill, each word forced through clenched teeth. "I'm the president of the HOA. This is community property. You have no right to do this." Her voice echoed, harsh, like metal, scraping metal, but instead of instilling fear, like before, this time it only drew faint scoffs. A few people shook their head. No one moved. No one stepped in. Everyone stood there, watching Claudia with cold, indifferent eyes, the kind of look she'd never known. Because until now, people always bowed their head. She screamed until her voice cracked, hands trembling as she clung to the gate, like a stranger locked out of what was once her fortress of power. I stepped forward. Key in my hand caught the sunlight, glinting. I wasn't in a rush. Every step I took was heavy and deliberate, as if the very air had stilled to witness this moment. I stopped directly in front of Claudia and looked her in the eye. My voice was low, carried across the space. "You once built this fence to shut out me and my daughter. You told us we didn't belong, but today, you're the one on the outside. This is justice, Claudia. This is the price you pay." As my words ended, crowd erupted, cheers and applause bursting like a wave. Some whistled, others clapped so hard, their palms turned red. A few residents laughed aloud, like they had just witnessed the perfect scene from a long-awaited film. Henderson stood beside me, nodding, his eyes lit up like a kid who had just won a game. Eliana squeezed my hand, face glowed, her lips curled into a proud smile. She whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "You gave me justice, Dad." Claudia trembled, her eyes rimmed with red. She tried to shout something else, but the words came out fractured, strangled. She backed away a few steps, eyes darting around, searching for anyone who might stand with her. But no one did. All those who once feared her, who once obeyed her orders out of guilt or habit, now looked at her as if she were a stranger. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. A dry click rang out as the gate unlatched, but I didn't walk through right away. I looked at Claudia one last time and said, "This is the difference between you and me. I have the power to lock people out, but I choose to open the gate for those I trust. You only knew how to build fences to exclude anyone you despise." Then I swung the gate wide open and invited the residents in. One by one, they stepped through, their eyes bright, hands patting my shoulder, laughter echoing like a celebration. Eliana was the last to walk. She paused, turned to glance at Claudia, not with hatred, not with bitterness, just one final look back at the past, then lifted her chin and stepped forward as if crossing into a new future, one where painful memories would no longer bind her. Claudia remained behind, both hands gripping the bar, face contorted in rage and humiliation. She shouted a few more things, threat, complaints, denial, but they echoed into a space now void of support. The residents no longer listened, they only watched, as if observing a ghost, repeating its final, meaningless frame. And in that moment, I knew the retaliation was complete. No court ruling was needed, no additional indictment required. That image Claudia locked outside, the very gate she once used to humiliate others, was the harshest verdict of all. The one who once stood at the top was now nothing more than a shadow, a name already slipping into obscurity. I turned away, leaving behind the sound of a soft breeze, and the footsteps of a community stepping together into a new chapter. There was no anger left in me, only peace. And I knew Eliana would grow up, remembering that strange morning when justice required no verdict. lipstick, because it had already spoken through action. That morning, the entire lakeside neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, bracing for something monumental. The air was thick, as if signaling that something was about to happen. From the model home to the path circling the lake, small groups of residents gathered, whispering and speculating. A light breeze rustled the trees, and the American flags hanging from porch railings fluttered gently, as if listening in. Notices plastered on utility poles and mailboxes displayed bold letters. Emergency meeting. Vote to remove HOA president. Everyone knew this wasn't just another meeting. It was the culmination of a long simmering fury. People showed up in greater numbers than ever before, including faces rarely seen over the years. The hall was packed. This time, there was no forced silence, no averted eyes or nervous throat clearing like in those tightly controlled meetings of the past. Instead, there were quiet conversations buzzing throughout, eyes lit with anticipation. Some carried old violation notices, ridiculous citations Claudia had personally signed. They held them like living proof, tangible evidence that they had endured enough, and today, they would finally speak. Claudia entered. The already buzzing room fell one beat silent, not out of fear as before, but because everyone wanted a clear look at the woman who had once stood above them all. She still tried to carry herself the same, hair pinned high, makeup precise, tailored suit immaculate, heels clicking steadily on the tile floor. But the morning light exposed what she couldn't mask. The heavy makeup didn't cover the dark circles under her eye, and the bright red lipstick couldn't distract from the trembling hand clinging tightly to her handbag. She held her head high, clinging to that old arrogance, but I saw it her gaze wasn't sharp anymore. Something inside her had. She was no longer certain. The meeting was led by Mr. Harold, an older resident with silver hair and a firm stance, once a high school. His voice came through the microphone, steady and deep, commanding without needing volume. We are here to decide whether Claudia Whitford still deserves to be president of the HOA. A simple sentence, yet it froze the entire room. Then, envelopes with ballots were distributed. No one hesitated. Pens hit the paper swiftly, decisively, no second thought. I glanced around and saw people who had once kept their heads down now steady and unflinching. Their eyes were no longer confused, no longer reluctant. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were crossing out the shadow that had loomed over them for years. When the ballots were collected, every vote was counted publicly, right in front of the resident. A whiteboard was set up, and each yes and no was handwritten in plain view. The room fell silent, like a stage awaiting its final. And then, the result appeared. Over 90% voted to remove Claudia. No one spoke for a beat, and then it erupted. Thunderous applause, cheers rising in waves, drowning out Claudia's faint, scattered protest. She was shouting something, but no one was listening. No one cared anymore. No one stood with her. Claudia stood motionless, her lips moving as if searching for a defense, but the sounds she made were now just empty echoes in a room that had already turned its back. She had nothing left, no title, no authority, no trust. Just days later, the news broke across digital headlines. Claudia was officially under financial investigation. The records Raymond had provided clear documentation of HOA funds funneled into disguised personal expenses had reached the proper authority. Local papers ran bold headline, Lakeside HOA, president accused of embezzlement. What's happening in the model neighborhood? On social media, the name Claudia Whitford was now inseparable from words like abuse of power, discrimination, and corruption. Her credibility was gone. Those who once flattered her, who boasted about being close to Claudia, vanished or fell silent as if they'd never known her. On sidewalks and front lawns, her name was no longer spoken with respect, only with eye rolls or weary sighs. Meanwhile, the neighborhood changed in visible ways. No more warning notices for planting the wrong flower. No more signs forbidding bikes on front lawn. People began flying their flags again, something once condemned as aesthetic disruption. Flower beds bloomed in every color. Dogs were walked freely, and kids laughed around the lake without fear of reprimand. An elderly Latina woman, once threatened with a fine for hanging laundry at the wrong hour, came up and hugged me tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. Thank you for giving us back our peace. Malik placed a hand firmly on my shoulder, his gaze steady. We're finally free of the chain. For the first time in years, I saw a community being reborn. HOA meetings were no longer about reading rules. They became spaces for real dialogue. People talked about greenery, weekend classes for kids, and summer block party. Henderson proposed planting more trees around the lake, and Gonzalez suggested organizing a neighborhood-wide Halloween celebration. Everyone had ideas. Everyone was heard. And suddenly, I understood. The real danger had never been the HOA itself. It was the silence of the people. When silence vanished, fear disappeared with. One afternoon, the sky was as clear as glass, and Eliana and I walked along the lake's entrance path. The iron gate now had a new lock. Key I still held, and the sign, Private Lake, Entry for Those I Trust, remained hanging, not as a means of control, but as a reminder. This time, I didn't shut the gate. I opened it wide, letting residents pass through in small groups, their chatter drifting through the air, laughter echoing from the lake's edge. Eliana ran ahead, her hair catching the wind, her eyes bright, as if they had never known tears. I slowed down, pausing to look at the lake. The water was still and clear, mirroring the blue sky above like a symbol of peace returning after the storm. In my hand, the key felt cold, but its weight profound. It wasn't just a tool to unlock a gate. It was a symbol of power that hadn't been corrupt. Claudia had built fences to divide, to push people out. I kept key to ensure justice would no longer be trampled beneath the heels of authority. I understood then that sometimes, justice doesn't come from courtrooms or paperwork. It comes from the courage to stand when everyone else stays silent. I turned to look at Eliana. She had stopped and was smiling at, a genuine, radiant smile, free of any lingering worry. I nodded back, silently telling myself, at last, justice is complete. And in that moment, I knew Lakeside had entered a new chapter. No more fear, no more glossy red notices, no more bitter cries of no entry. Only a free, united community, and a peaceful lake reflecting the faces of those who dared to rewrite their own fate. That morning, the sky over Lakeside was an unusually clear blue, as if nature itself wished to help close an old chapter and usher in a new beginning. Thin clouds drifted slowly across a windless sky, while sunlight stretched across the still surface of the lake like a mirror, scattering shimmering reflections over the water. Eliana and I walked hand in hand along the stone path leading to the gate, our steps unhurried but steady, our hearts light as if shedding a burden we had carried for years. That path, once where we used to quietly turn around after being denied entry, now felt like it led to a space unbound, open and full of life. The barbed steel gate that had once stood tall like a declaration of power, a symbol of oppression, a line drawn between those allowed and those unworthy, was gone. In its place was a clean entrance, newly paved with warm red brick. No more warning sign, no guard, no suspicious glances. Just a straight path to the lake, where anyone could walk without fearing rejection. Eliana looked up at me, her eyes glowing in a way I hadn't seen throughout all the heavy days before. There was no hesitation left, no trace of the wound inflicted by humiliation, only the radiance and confidence of a child who now understood her worth. I leaned down, placed a hand on her shoulder, locked eyes with her, and spoke with a firm yet gentle voice, a statement both of us needed to hear again. No one has the right to build a fence around your dignity, no matter their title, no matter what key they hold. Your dignity belongs to you, and no one can take it away. Eliana pressed her lips together and nodded, her eyes glistening, but lit with pride and resolve. I knew that what I had just said wasn't a temporary comfort, it was a seed of self-respect, one that would stay with her for life, helping her stand tall before anyone who believed power outranked principle. We brought along an old fishing rod, the one her mother used to use, and headed to the lake's edge. The scenery was familiar, the willow leaning over the water, the weathered stone benches, the ducks gliding by, but the feeling was entirely new. No more fences, no more shouts of, "You're not allowed here," no more invisible fear that made people avoid what was once the heart of the neighborhood. Only the soft breeze brushing the water's surface, the scent of damp grass after the night's dew, and the quiet lapping of water on the shore, whisper a song of peace. Eliana and I sat down, baited the line, unhurried, with no need for words. We just sat there, listening to the wind, letting our minds rest after so many stormy days. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, so softly it almost blended into the lake's murmur, "Dad, this is the first time the lake has ever felt peaceful." I smiled but said nothing, because within me rose a wordless peace I thought I'd never feel again. People walking by paused to greet us. Some families brought their children to play, and some elderly residents strolled by with their dog. They moved at ease, their eyes light, their smiles effortless. No one was tense about being warned or written up. No one worried whether they had violated some rule that day. The lake had returned to its rightful place as a communal space, a place where everyone had a part, where laughter, voices calling out to one another, and brief neighborly conversations all served as proof that the fear once rooted here was gone. I remembered everything that had come before. I saw Claudia again, standing in front of the fence back then, face cold as steel, her gaze arrogant, as if she alone decided who was worthy of the air around the lake. She once built that fence to assert her power, once believed fear was the ultimate tool of control, but in the end, she was the one locked out, screaming into the void, reduced to a shadow of herself. The lesson couldn't be clearer. Those who abuse power always end up trapped in the very barriers they erect. What begins as a tool to exclude others eventually becomes the cage that severs them from the community. Claudia became living proof, a memory no one who witnessed it would ever forget. I looked at Eliana and saw her burst into laughter as a fish took the bait, her voice echoing over the still lake, pure and clear. I knew she would grow up, that one day she would leave this place to chase wider horizons. But I also knew that she would always carry the memory of today with the memory memory of her own courage, of the truth justice is never out of reach, so long as someone is willing to stand up for it. And I believe that today's lesson would help her never bow to injustice, never forget that her dignity is hers alone, untouchable by anyone. The sun was now high, casting a light that made the lake glisten like it had been laced with silver. Eliana and I remained there for a long time, saying nothing, but the silence was full of meaning. It wasn't the quiet of exhaustion, it was the quiet of the stillness after a long storm, the moment a father and daughter reclaim a peace that had once been stolen. It was the kind of feeling I wanted to remember forever, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was deserved. I gently squeezed Eliana's hand, stared out across the lake, and whispered, "We've won." And I knew that whisper didn't need to be loud, because it was the perfect period to a long, bitter story, one that ended in light, in freedom, and in unshakable belief in the dignity of every human being. Looking back on everything we went through, I realized the journey felt like a long, arduous epic filled with trials and paradox. From the moment Claudia erected the fence, blocking access to the lake, to the day the residents finally turned their backs on her, every seemingly minor detail had formed an irreversible chain of events. What haunts me most isn't just the blinding red violation notice or the shrill shouting at community meetings. It's the humiliation Eliana endured when her friends mocked, when she heard the cruel, prejudiced words from people who claimed to be defending community value. Those wounds cut deep, forcing me to understand that some battles are simply unavoidable. But from that very darkness, I learned that true strength doesn't lie in the loudest voice, but in quiet persistence. Had I responded with only anger, I might have fallen right into Claudia's trap, becoming the reckless dissenter she wanted to paint me as. Instead, each piece of evidence, each story shared by residents, each line in the bank records I gathered became a spear that pierced the armor of her power. When the truth came to light, that infamous "no entry" shout that once made the entire neighborhood flinch became a national punchline. That story also made me realize the value of unity. If it had only been Eliana and me, we could never have dismantled a machine that had existed for years. But when Henderson whispered the secret about the lake, when Gonzalez dared to recount the shame of being fined for his flower pot, when Malik displayed the citation for his American flag, when the Rivera couple recalled the morning HOA guards, stopped them from walking their dog, it all became a powerful current. We were no longer isolated, but a collective, and that collective was something Claudia could never control, because it was born from the very pain and injustice she inflicted. The moment I held up the lake's ownership certificate in front of the assembly was the moment the community understood. Real power doesn't come from threat, comes from truth. Claudia trembled, shouting, "We'll sue." But the truth about the expired lease choked the last breath out of her defiance. The woman who once commanded from the podium became the one locked out, forced to watch residents pass through the very gate she had built to humiliate. That wasn't just retribution, it was proof that history always shifts when tyrants grow too confident in their own invincibility. I've come to understand that justice doesn't always arrive in courtrooms or government offices, it comes when a community collectively says, enough. When the residents voted to remove Claudia, when every scornful glance placed years of bowed head, that was the harshest sentence she could ever receive. And when national media broadcast her screaming at the gates, when the internet mockingly crowned her the no-entry queen, her credibility collapsed completely. There is no place left for someone who wore fences as a crown and ruled fear. What remains the part I cherish most is how Eliana has changed. From a little girl once brought to tears by her peers' mockery, she witnessed, with her own eyes, the one who had humiliated her beau before the truth. On the day we sat by the lake with our fishing rod, I told her, "No one has the right to build a fence against your dignity." It wasn't just a lesson, it was the distilled essence of our entire journey. I saw her eyes light up, as if engraving in her heart that dignity is non-negotiable, and no fence can ever confine it. The greatest lesson I've taken from all of this is that those who abuse power will, sooner or later, trap themselves in the very walls they built. Claudia raised fences to shut others out only to be locked out herself. She imposed fees to hoard money to buy the lake only to lose it to someone else. She sowed fear to maintain control, only for the community to rise from that fear and turn it into a force of unity. Everything she did, seemingly airtight, was in fact a trap she dug beneath her own feet. And this story doesn't end at Lakeside. It stands as a mirror for any place where power is abused. Wherever someone hides behind rules to serve their greed, there will be ordinary people brave enough to resist. Wherever fences are raised to exclude, there will be hands to tear them down. Justice may arrive slowly, but it always arrives, and when it does, it carries the power to obliterate every lie. I believe that when people hear this story, they won't just feel vindicated by Claudia's downfall, they'll feel something stir within them. A push that says, if the day comes when they're faced with injustice, they must not lower their head. Push that reminds them dignity is never dictated by a citation or a cold, metal lock, and a push that says, courage and resolve, anyone can flip the narrative. As the story closes, the image that lingers is not Claudia's shouting. It's that of a community walking through an open gate together, breathing the air of freedom. That is the moment that matters most, not just because it marked the end of an era of abuse, but because it began a new chapter, one of freedom, unity, and dignity. And to me, the most important part is that Eliana can now sit by the lake, smiling in peace, knowing that justice is not some distant ideal, it is something that can exist. The moment someone dares to protect, our story at Lakeside has come to an end, but its lesson remains. A lesson not just for the residents of one small neighborhood, but for anyone who has ever been oppressed, who has ever felt their dignity trampled. Don't be afraid of fences because fences never last. Truth and justice are what endure, and we will always be able to step through and reclaim the light on the other side.